What bonkers stunt have you seen someone pull at work and still not get fired? I had a girl steal money from other crew's bags in the locker and changing room. Instead of firing her, they just took the door off the room and put in a camera, so now we have to show up to work in a uniform with a shirt over it. It's very hot here and I end up sweaty by the time I get to work. She also called in one time saying that her sister died and needed some time off. She's an only child. After all of this, she got rehired after she quit for another job that didn't end up working out for her. I work at a web hosting tech support company, and a coworker accidentally deleted another customer's website. This was on a Unix system, so it wasn't possible to undo the delete. He deleted the command history to cover his mistake and then told the customer that the website was lost due to a hard drive failure. The customer hadn't been keeping backups and said that he lost his entire livelihood. The employee told management about the situation and they ran with it to avoid getting sued. They told the customer that hardware issues sometimes happen, and because he hadn't opted into our managed backup services, the data loss was on him. They offered the customer several months of free web hosting as compensation, and the problem went away for them at least. A week after seeing this play out, I put in my 2 weeks' notice. Used his corporate credit card for over $10,000 in personal purchases. He was reprimanded but not fired or made to pay the company back. Within the next year, he did the exact same thing, and only then was he fired.
Damn, someone brought a $300 lamp for their office and expensed it at my last job, and they were fired.
I worked at a school for kids who need emotional support. We had a classroom aide who would scream at kids until they cried and then actively mock them for crying. These kids were 7 and came from horrible home situations. It sucked to work in a place that allowed that sort of behavior to continue. She was close family friends with the principal. This was reported. She still got a letter of recommendation out of her BFF, the principal, but she no longer works with children. It's very hard to help a child when they learn from a young age that adults aren't able to make things better and that adults are capable of incredibly mean things. They destroyed an overpass with an excavator improperly loaded on a trailer. My goodness, and to think a waiter can be fired if they drop a few glasses or plates at their restaurant. That's like an insignificant fraction of the cost of damages in this story. Disrupting a major traffic point for a couple of weeks is honestly impressive. I bet that guy was glad he had his union. They forged a document, really obviously, and then lied about not forging it. Then they admitted to forging it once the lie was even slightly questioned. A partner at the firm wanted her fired, but then another one didn't. So the forger stayed. Energize a circuit someone was still working on. I had 3 guys from the power company do that to us a couple of years ago. We were inside, still making taps in a gutter, when they re-energized the service without asking if we were done. Knocked my pal off his feet but did no serious damage. We went outside and raised hell, and they got real sheepish and just left for a while. Accidentally sent out the entire company of 3,000 plus employees, headcount, to the company distro. File contained everyone's salary, birthday, government numbers, all the good stuff. Saw a guy whip out his equipment and start running around trying to pee on this one other guy. He got a splash on him too. Active duty military here for anyone curious. Guy got caught on CCTV backing up into a BMW at a dealership. Got out, looked at it and just left. He still works here, I don't know how. He must have a video of the boss cheating on his wife or something. A few years ago, I was working in a big company in my hometown. They hired me to create a website because they wanted to get bigger. A graphic and fashion designer in the same company thought I was hired for her department because our offices were close and because I was doing both the programming and the design of the website. I had an appointment with another company that would help us set up secure online payments and manage inventories across our stores and the main factory. The graphic designer welcomed the representatives of this company, which wasn't even her task at all, and then cancelled the appointment and the contract because she didn't believe I was good enough with computers. They called a customer stupid for leaving his phone behind, and then refused to let him back in the theater so he could find it. The phone ended up getting stolen by one of the overnight cleaners, and after a few days was brought back, and the customer finally got his phone back. At a previous job, we had an employee who was called in to clean on an as-needed basis. The employee, who we'll call Fred, owed a lot of child support. After an unusually long break of not working, we called Fred in to clean the workplace. I think he expected to be paid under the table, because when he was given a paycheck, it was damn near zero because of all the back-due child support he owed, which we were forced to take from his paycheck. He literally started screaming, swearing, called the boss every name you can think of, punched walls, and threatened to shoot up the place. The boss still calls him back to work as needed to clean because he's really good at cleaning. He liked throwing ice cubes into the deep fryer. He'd stand far enough away that he wouldn't get splashed, which made it a complete surprise to the person working the fryer. If you've never done this, it kind of causes a mini explosion of bubbles in molten grease, which splashes everywhere and at the very least makes a mess. When this got too boring, he started stealing kids' meal toys and chucking them into the fryer. It took longer for them to start melting, and if he couldn't get them out, we had to turn the thing off for the rest of the day because it takes hours for it to cool off long enough to retrieve something, and then at least another hour to heat back up. I can't remember what it was he threw, but it caught on fire and he ended up pulling it out with a pair of metal tongs and threw it in the sink. Then he turned on the water and made, to his surprise, a bigger fire. Did he get burned? Yes. Did he get fired? No. Did he do it again? Sort of. I think he went back to ice cubes after that. The boss just kind of shook her head and let him keep working there. My coworkers got caught in a compromising position in the walk-in where the food is stored. There wasn't even a write-up. Neither of them got in trouble. The owners were too busy snorting white snow in the office. The place closed down after losing its liquor license for selling alcohol to minors. It was, not a very well-managed establishment. The store manager got caught adding hours which he didn't work to his time card. He got a reprimand and they removed the ability for managers to edit their own hours. About a month later, he gets caught using another manager's login to add more hours he didn't work. Another slap on the wrist and he's still working at the same place. I worked with a guy who literally had no job. He was the studio supervisor, but there was no activity in the studio to supervise because the studio had effectively become non-operational. He coasted for a full 8 years at this job. He'd come in the morning, open his email, get coffee, gossip and complain about the industry for an hour, leave for an hour, come back for lunch, leave for another 3 hours, come back, send a few emails, and then officially leave for the day. It was infuriating and majestic. A guy I worked with ran a food truck into an aeroplane. When they substance tested him, he peed super dirty. After being told that he'd be getting random tests for a while, they showed up at his house within a week. He told them he couldn't because he just smoked yesterday. He was still employed when I transferred from that airport. As a bonus, one day the same guy crapped his pants at work and sat in the break room until the smell became pretty loud. Someone told him he should go home and his response was, "Nah, dog, the damage is already done." My boss forged my name on a number of documents because she didn't have the required certifications to sign the documents herself, and I'd refused to sign them. I know this because after things went horribly south, they tried to claim I'd been the one to screw up and showed me my and her signature. She got promoted again instead of fired. That way I didn't have to quit. You'll never guess whose mother owned the company. I guess that if the company's big enough, there's no such thing as too much fricking nepotism. Honestly, the fact that someone can get promoted despite documented incompetence on nothing other than a family connection is just so damn crappy. I worked at a pizza restaurant when I was 16. The place was absolute anarchy. Impossible to get fired. I'd smoke various substances with my bosses. They joke with me, "Try not to get too blazed today," all while on the clock. The supervisor would take an hour or more on his 30-minute breaks and come back blasted as all hell. We'd all make ourselves free food whenever we wanted. Nobody was trained properly, so obviously proper procedures were out the window. No one would claim their tips, so we were being sued by the IRS. Again, no one followed procedure, so the health department was on our butt. Yikes. I worked at a really nice restaurant, and our head chef at the time would come in so spun out on crystal, he'd admit to people he was seeing shadow people, and would often have us help out on the line only to be a total mess. Also at the same place, one of his other friends who he smoked with was noticeably tweaked and cut half his finger off in the slicer one time. I wouldn't say absolutely bonkers, but I worked closely with the federal government, and the number of people just hanging around until retirement, doing jobs that have been obsolete for 20 years is remarkable. There's a guy I know whose only job is to scan things, like scan paper into PDFs. He's a federal employee being paid $50K a year. I literally do this job. As part of my degree, I must work in a place my college chooses for a semester, but still pay college fees. I scan all day and do nothing else. I'm replacing a man who retired last year who was on $50K, like you said. I take a total of 2 hours off a day for breaks, and I've been told I'm much more efficient than the last guy. I have seen more than 0 nurses mistreat patients. So I've seen too many. Unfortunately, unless it's flagrant and there's enough eyewitnesses, and as long as it's on old people or severely mentally ill people who have little to no family support, nobody gives a flying crap.
You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe.
Sleep for 3 hours. I was brand new on the job, a corporate thing, and my new coworker came up to me on the weekend and said, "I was up really late last night, I'm going to go lay down for a few minutes." 3 hours later, he woke up and came out to work again without any measure of apology. In the interim, one of the people we worked for found him asleep and told my boss. He got a warning later. Close second being a coworker that hacked the company's network, using the term hacked somewhat loosely, to get an internet access password we weren't allowed to have. Would have gotten away with it if he hadn't also changed their file structure to have folder names like "FU, I want internet access." He also got a warning. An old buddy of mine worked for a really big gaming company in the early 2000s that was just about to ship a major title. Like, major. Because of beta testing, there was a code in the game that would disable the beta copies the day after the game finally dropped. His job was to make sure that code was removed before they burned all of the official CDs for the game's release. Guess who forgot to remove the code? The company had already burned tens of thousands, maybe more, of game discs, and boxed them up for shipment before my buddy realized his mistake and came clean to his boss. They had to reburn, replace, and rebox every copy of the game and do it in time to meet the launch date. Cost a lot of people a lot of extra time and grief, but ultimately my buddy got to keep his job. And for those interested, the company was Bethesda Softworks, and I believe the game was Morrowind. Their offices were in Rockville, Maryland at the time, and I used to go to meet my friend over there for lunch every couple of weeks. If I recall correctly, he was in charge of coding the sky effects for the game. Well, that and removing the code that would brick the game after the release. This one woman screaming at the supervisor at the call center when people were on the phones, cursing, saying she'd beat him up because he gave her too many leads. Whilst working at a local hospital, a nursing student snorting a line of whatever in scrubs in a hospital bathroom to post on Snapchat. Or the 2 housekeepers who engaged in a fistfight on an elevator, only to continue said fight as they arrived at their destination. Finally, one I can answer. Our department went for a team-building overnight stay abroad. The next day, when we were supposed to meet at the airport, he was nowhere to be found. His phone was off, bosses rang the hospitals, missing persons report, you name it. A week later, the bosses went back to the country to find him again. Nothing. Wife and child hadn't heard anything. The week later, he turns up for work like nothing had happened. He decided to jump on an earlier flight to Thailand for a week's holiday without telling a soul. A couple of meetings with the bosses, never mentioned again. I guess his wife made him feel it, but that was never disclosed. I've been on some deployments to disaster-struck areas, and the crap that I've heard and seen is frickin' nuts. My last partner was telling me about his co-workers down south who charged like more than 500 hours of false overtime a year for the last 5 years or so. He was actually hired because the people going over the numbers thought those guys were crazily overworked. Thank God they're finally being investigated. My partner was a whistleblower since he didn't want to be involved. It should be a slam dunk case since they need to swipe their security pass for the work they do, so if they don't show up in the logs, they obviously weren't there. Then there are the people who are old and just refuse to retire because they don't have anything else going on in their lives. Their skills are no longer relevant and they can't or won't develop new ones, but the government can't make them retire, so they send them out on deployments so that their overhead budget doesn't get strained. So here I am in a hurricane-struck area with a 65-plus-year-old guy that can't use a smartphone to navigate and can't drive or write because his hands shake. I thought this was an exaggeration until I saw his writing. It looked like it was from a seismograph. Just because his office wanted to push him off on someone else for a couple of months. I mean, for frick's sake, I've got enough to worry about between the crystal heads in rural areas, the weapon crowd worried about looters, and the spotty phone service. It's frickin' adult daycare. I work in the office of a major retailer. I have a co-worker who's made several negligent blunders that have costed the company millions and lost sales. He's regularly failed to monitor the flow of advertised goods until it's too late to react, and we've lost sales. He once decided that if someone he works with F's up, it isn't his problem to fix or even report. He wouldn't even tell them about it so they could fix it. Of course, it's quite literally his problem to fix it. This has caused lots of failed shipments and flows that again caused lost sales. He failed to monitor inventory levels on regular stock items. Sales obviously spiked during Christmas time, which has caused him to run out on half his inventory and thus lose sales. As of yet, he still hasn't fully normalized all of it. To my knowledge, he's only gotten a formal reprimand for that last one. How it took so long is beyond me. And yet, the retail salespeople are the ones on minimum wage and getting screamed at because the store doesn't have a certain brand of wax strips by Karens. Maybe switch one of the higher performing floor staff out with this guy. Punishment and promotion meted out all at once. We hired this woman to my team. Her job was to do exactly what I did. We work from home, but we have constant conference calls and a ton of work to do. It's simply not possible to slack off without being noticed. I trained her and she shadowed me for a couple of months. She should have been ready to go off on her own, but she kept asking the same questions again and again. It's like she wasn't even sort of listening to anything we said, which was super annoying. But then, about 3 months in, she disappeared. Like stopped logging into calls, stopped logging into Skype, stopped everything. We emailed, texted, and called for a while until she finally responded that she had been in hospital with a hernia. Now, my mother had a hernia surgery in her 70s and was home within a few hours. So that's a red flag. We were also stunned and deeply offended that she never ever bothered to call, text, email, or anything to say she'd be out. Never in my 20-year career have I seen anything like it. In my personal opinion, I thought she would have been fired right then and there. But our boss didn't want to make a big deal out of it. She didn't want to tell the big boss, for some reason. I'm still baffled by that, but that meant neither the powers that be nor HR had any idea it had ever happened. So eventually, after having fallen off the planet for 10 days, the new hire finally came back. Both our boss and I counseled her a lot about communication. I mean, things happen, we get it, just talk to us. Let us know what's going on. Benefit of the doubt, right? Yeah. A little over a month later, she did it again. At first, I noticed she wasn't joining calls or logging into Skype, and she kept saying she was having connectivity issues. Fine. Once again, just tell us. And for God's sake, call tech support. But then she was offline for an entire week, so we tried hunting her down again. Nothing. No response, no communication, nada. This time, the issue was escalated and HR got involved. After a total of 2 weeks, she apparently told HR she was having medical issues. She was counseled that she had to log on and fill out her timesheets to reflect she was out of office for all the time she was gone. She was given a deadline of a week to do this. It never happened and she was still employed. Please note that at this point she still hadn't spoken a word to either myself or our boss. So now we're at 3 weeks of radio silence and HR contacts our boss to say the new hire had reached out to say she's filing short-term disability. Fine, whatever. We wait, and we wait, and wait. And obviously she never filed. So finally, a month after disappearing for the second time with zero communication, she was terminated. The amount of work I had to pick up thanks to her disappearing act was madness. I'm talking upwards of 80 hours a week for more than a month. I'm still bitter about it. Wisconsin. Pretty nice hotel. Our room service chef. I got in for the night and my coworker is fielding a call of a very loud guest. I can tell it's going badly. Very badly. He hangs up, looks down in sadness for a bit, gets up and slowly walks to the kitchen. His next words were burnt into my head. John, can I see your hand? The cook looks down and notices his band-aid is missing and made its way into a pizza that went up to a customer. He said his wife had it in her mouth. No, not fired. A guy who works at a local grocery store would get caught whacking the mule at work with the bathroom stall door open. He was caught so much that he was eventually relocated to the gas station, and he has a serious attitude problem because he thinks it's because he's overweight. Repeatedly sleep. Not like a 2-minute doze, I'm talking hours. He's been caught multiple times and was even filmed twice by a new hire. Union won't let him be touched, not even a suspension. Our union rep walked into my cube to talk to a guy who was asleep. Instead of waking him up or anything, he just quietly said, "Oh, I'm sorry," and walked off to do whatever it was that he did. Don't sleep at your desk is right in the union rules, come on. I'm glad I don't work there anymore. My female coworker printed off undressed photos of a male coworker and passed them out like flyers. Didn't even get a write-up. I was out to lunch with 3 coworkers. Collectively, there are 2 males and 2 females. We were all attorneys, by the way. One of the males is very into the other woman. She is also a hijab-wearing Muslim woman. The male coworker proceeds to get up from eating and starts to massage her head. Her hijab starts to fall off. We all tell him to stop. He explained that he was getting the brain spiders off. I was mortified. She was. So was the other male. But he continued working there. I worked from home at my last job, and my coworker would sometimes just not log in until like 11 a.m. and would just completely skip meetings that she was supposed to run. One time she missed a meeting with our boss, and my boss just goes, "Well, I bet she was up working late, so she's coming in later." I knew a guy whose wife worked at a place called Happy Joe's Pizza. He just got out of prison after 26 years. He put a fire poker through a crystal head's chest and killed him. His wife would let him in when they closed, and they'd do the deed on the make table, and he just said he'd splooge all over the meats and cheeses regularly for 2 years. I am so glad I live on the other side of town. I work in the healthcare field. I had one coworker who'd never wasted his narcotics properly with a witness. He'd just have them signed out solo and say, "Oh yeah, the patient didn't want them, so I disposed of it," with zero verification. He also had a lot of liquid narcotics whose counts suddenly went mysteriously off after he'd been on shift. Somehow he didn't get fired or even investigated. He wound up quitting after just a few months, and good riddance, to be honest. I had 8 servers delivered very late one day and left outside the data center. Everything in boxes on a pallet. The janitor thinks it's trash, takes all of them to the trash compactor and just crushes them. Each box weighed more than 80 pounds. They weren't ours, but a company we contracted with. We had to buy all new servers, and the guy didn't even get a write-up. He had a family member on the board. The janitor is an idiot, but who just leaves a bunch of servers outside a data center? This data center in Maybury or something?
Has anyone here ever been a soldier fighting against the US? What was it like? My grandfather was conscripted to fight for the North Korean military during the Korean War. He was at the Battle of Incheon, and he likened the dread that he felt to what one must feel when faced with a massive tidal wave that is about to engulf you and everyone you know. Couple this with the fact that many North Korean troops were told horror stories, that the American troops were cannibals, for example, and that the average American Marine was much taller and more physically robust than the average North Korean soldier. You can imagine how scared he was. He said that the Chinese and North Korean units were absolutely obliterated and that they never stood a chance against the Marines. All his words, not mine. My uncle, who I'll be seeing in a week for Thanksgiving, was there. He's 86 now. He still will not talk about it. His kids did not know he was in Korea until they were in their mid to late 20s. I remember when I was little, he would mow the lawn without a shirt, and I could see the scars on his abdomen. When I asked about them, he said they were from having his appendix taken out. Clearly not the case as an adult looking back on it. To this day, he is a staunch pacifist. This is much akin to the horror stories told in Japan after America dropped the atomic bombs, that American troops were savages who were going to come into Japan and rape all the women. That is why there was such a high suicide rate in Japan in the months after the war. Terrifying stuff. This is true. My grandfather tells me stories about Korea. He's a US Marine. He tells me about how easy it was to just mow through any resistance ever. I condensed this part. The only thing he said that ever scared him over there was waking to an earthquake. I was just a 7-year-old kid when my parents were watching CNN/BBC while I was playing video games. It was about some army jets taking off during the night. My dad turned to me and said something along the lines of, "It's begun, get to the basement now." Sometime later, the first explosions could be heard. The NATO/US bombing of Serbia in '99 had started. I remember spending time in the basement with other residents. I remember how the building shook when the bombs exploded. The fear of what was coming after the sirens went off. They destroyed all 3 bridges across the Danube in my city, cutting us off from a part of our family. One day, a bomb hit the refinery, so we couldn't stay in the basements anymore because of the CO2. Then, a bomb hit about 100 meters from our building, and shrapnel went through the blinds and windows and embedded itself in the opposite wall of our neighbor's flat. That was when we decided to move somewhere else where the Americans had nothing to aim for. A smaller town. We were safer there, but we could still hear the jets flying above us and bombs going off in the distance. When someone shot down the F-117 stealth jet, it was a huge hell yeah moment for Serbia. That's my short story of surviving a war versus USA. Edit, I forgot to mention they were supposedly only bombing tactical targets. One of my professors was an undergrad in Serbia during the war. A major government building in Belgrade was hit and the whole house shook violently like an earthquake. It was a very old stone building that collapsed. It was crazy. Her and a professor of hers tried to spend the time, the university got bombed a few times, trying to make some rudimentary communication device that the Serbian soldiers could use. That's really crazy. Hopefully this won't get buried, but my hopes are not too high. My father was a sniper during the bombardment in Yugoslavia, and my best friend's father was a member of the elite unit called Tigers while the war in Kosovo was raging. I'll be short because I have to sleep, but my father told me it was like trying to repel a wave on the beach by building a castle out of sand. You fought, you may have won some small encounters, be it by accident or pure luck, but you always knew that if they wanted, they could just kill us all and be done with it. Not a nice time for Yugoslavia, that's for sure. I was in Kosovo during the war. My sister almost got killed by a Serbian sniper. That's crazy. Like I said in another comment, that's how the KLA felt against the Serbian military. I don't think it was as bad as the US, but Serbia was fighting farmers with AK-47s. My dad was never with us, and I was scared I would never see him again. Some of my cousins died fighting. Others never returned from prison camps. We would hear horrible stories about Serbian soldiers and how they were animals. When we were marching across the border into Macedonia, some of the soldiers would give us food and tell us that they were sorry for what we were going through. It was surreal, and we didn't trust them. We actually threw the food away because we thought it was poisoned, even though we were starving. Now I realize that they were just trying to stop the suffering, I guess. Yugoslavia may have been bad, but it was nothing compared to time in Kosovo during the war. My great uncle fought on the German side of World War II. He fought all over the place. Africa, Italy, a small stint in Russia, and he defended France from the D-Day invasion. He was later able to move to the United States as a war refugee. He said that all of his officers would constantly tell him, when you're fighting the Americans, you must think of the least probable way they will attack you, because that will be the way that they attack you. He also said that when you were fighting Americans, more so than any other country's army he fought, you had to have eyes on the back of your head. Thank you for sharing. I always find it more than impressive to hear of soldiers who fought on more than one front in World War II. Sebastian Junger very briefly touches on this in War. He writes at length about how incredibly terrifying and physically transforming it is to be in combat for American soldiers. Given all that, Junger then asks one of the American soldiers what it must be like for a Taliban combatant to face off against an Apache helicopter, and the soldier pretty much just shudders. I remember watching a documentary where some Dutch, journalist joins the Taliban to film what it's like for them for like 3 months. Can't recall the name at the moment. At one point, the unit he's with gets information that their commander's position has been compromised and has to move to another location. It's briefly mentioned that the Taliban are used to attacks by drones, etc. However, the commander is seen to be visibly worried because it might be an AC-130. Edit, the name of the documentary is Taliban Behind the Masks, thanks to AmITheA for finding it. The part which I am talking about is at 23 minutes onward. From a combat tour in Afghanistan, I can definitely attest to that. When the Apaches / fast movers / AC-130 gunships show up, all of a sudden no one wants to play anymore. My great uncle was on the Italian side in World War II and was a captured POW to America. From what he told me, people wanted to be captured by the US. They were treated badly by their own and how great America was. In World War II, the Germans and some of our allies often commented on how chaotic the US Army appeared to be. I believe the quote was, "War is chaos and the American Army practices it on a daily basis." Other armies were slow, disciplined, methodical, etc. The perception was that Americans were unpredictable, undisciplined, but prone to ingenuity. Not just our generals, but right down to the grunt soldier level. I understand most who fought us viewed this as a strength. I remember reading an article a while back that one of the reasons Americans were so unpredictable to Europeans was the fact that they were one of the first national armies to use guerrilla tactics, and then we literally got a masterclass from fighting the various Indian wars. Gonna be buried, but oh well. My dad was an anti-aircraft gunner in Hanoi during the Vietnam War. He still wakes up screaming in the middle of the night. Quite often, really. My dad did basic training in Vietnam before he managed to escape, but as a kid, I remember him telling me stories about how messed up everything was during wartime. He was in his 20s when it was all going down, but he remembers walking through a field with his friends, and in a split second, several of them blew up from a landmine. Another story he told me that sticks with me to this day was when some of his friends were out drinking the night before they were supposed to enlist. Sitting around a table, completely hammered, singing songs and trying to forget about the terrible things they may have to encounter, one of the friends dropped a grenade underneath and ended it all before the hell even began. I had the opportunity to be OPFOR, pretend batteries, for a Spec Ops raid one night recently. We all had basic roles to play to make sure the good guys got practice at typical scenarios, but we were allowed to do whatever we wanted within the confines of the role we were given. My role was to be a squirter from the main target building. When the raid rolled up, I was to fire off some rounds and bolt as fast as possible over a hilly area and take up cover in an adjacent building. Then, when and if they came to my building, try to light up as many good guys as possible before being shot. The blacked out Hummers roll up and I unload my rounds. After emptying a mag, I bolt for the second building. I'm not usually a nervous type of person, but it was either the sprint or the fact that those Hummers were really terrifying, but my heart rate didn't slow down after I'd stopped running. I remember thinking two things. First, how strange it was that I was so scared, since I knew we were using simunition and this was a war game. And second, that I knew for a fact I was going to die. I was outnumbered and outmatched. They had night vision and I was armed with a single AK-47. The sense of dread was really vivid, and I remember imagining noises and sights and kept playing out an operator sneaking up behind me in my mind. The next surprising thing was that when they rolled up to my building, they weren't sneaky or silent as I imagined in the books, just as before. Yet they also weren't yelling at each other like I had learned from cop shows when they clear rooms. They were all talking to each other in calm voices and using first names, relaying information about the current situation in a methodical manner. I had left a light at one corner of the building in hopes that I could spring a trap from the other. I turned the corner and unloaded a magazine as fast as possible at the parked Hummer, barely aiming. All I could think about is the 10 to 20 guns all silently hunting for the slightest movement. Then, and I'll never forget this, I saw the most eerie sight imaginable. A red dot, bigger than I'd picture or ever seen at the range, racing across the sand towards me. As I threw in a new mag and turned the other direction to check my 6, I had just enough time to catch the second red dot repeating the first move as if they were synchronized divers. I've never been more impressed and mortified in my life. The next thing I felt was pretty surreal. In short, I was hit in the chest and in the back at the exact same moment by two operators rounding the sides of the building. I was on a corner. As I retreated from one side of the building to the other, fearing the first shooter, I ran directly into his counterpart. Their bullets, simunition, contacted me at approximately the same place on my chest and back. I listened to them clear the inside of the building. Those same cool methodical voices, first names, nothing like what I imagined. Then they searched my dead body. They began to take off my mask, paintball type contraption, to ID my face, and the plastic was cutting into my eyebrow. So I reached up to help them take it off without hurting me. One of the operators standing watch over me almost shot me and politely asked me to inform them verbally of any other movements I would make. Anyway, to wrap this long story up, afterwards I met all the guys that were on the op. There were about 20 and they were all smart as hell. Many of them had gone to college and enlisted anyway in order to join Spec Ops. Several of them spoke multiple languages and none of them were what I imagined. They were all humble, completely professional, and extremely thankful for us volunteers that they lit up. Basically, I don't know how it would feel to fight US soldiers with real ammo, and it made me pray I never will. It seemed pointless. Disclaimers, these guys weren't practicing with air support that night. It would have been even more terrifying with that on my mind. Also, a friend of mine who's an operator wasn't sure why they'd have red dots equipped while using night vision goggles. I have no idea, I just know what I saw. Maybe it was an intimidation factor? I don't know. It almost made me poop myself. You don't really wear night vision goggles to move around. Navigating stairs and other rough terrain, you want full field of view and true depth perception. Granted, I've only had really limited experience using them on exercises. Maybe special forces types wear them so much they can function with no depth perception and a tiny field of view. And the red dot's great for snap shooting with or without NVGs anyway. I'm military, but not in a trade that uses either of these. I just turn a screwdriver and explain to the guys who bring busted stuff in why using the radio to hammer tent pegs is a bad idea. While I cannot speak from experience, I'm an American, I can relay something my father mentioned to me a few years ago. He was a Marine during the conflict in Grenada, and he was also active during the first Gulf War. He has never gone into great detail about his combat history, and frankly, I wouldn't want to have him rewalk those moments. But he did mention one time how you can see a man's fear before you see him. Kind of cryptic, I know, but that one statement says a lot. He mentioned how you could hear them yelling and that the yells were not the confident kind. He meant that these men knew they were about to fight Americans and all their fancy toys and extreme training. They knew that the Marines were coming to kill them. My dad always told me that one of the greatest weapons our military has is the image that we conjure in the minds of our enemies. While it is one thing to fight someone who you feel is an equal or lesser match to you, it's a completely different scenario to fight someone who you truly feel is a monstrous force of war. I can't speak for the other branches strictly because I don't have a close personal relationship with someone who's enlisted and I have never enlisted. However, I can tell you that my father and all of his Marine buddies are absolutely vicious if prodded in an aggressive situation. In Grenada, the Marines were only supposed to take the top 10% of the island and the Army the rest. The Marines landed and began their attack. At the end, the Marines held about 90% of the island and the Army the rest. The OP-4 were fleeing from the Marines to fight the Army. I'm actually former US Army. I spent an entire summer serving as an OP-4 opposing force at one of the Army elite training centers. Basically, I fought US soldiers in a giant simulation. I'd actually agree to some extent with the pushover comments for some units. The US Army is just so damn massive, some units certainly will look completely incompetent. Also, outside of a few SOF units and light infantry, there isn't a whole lot of emphasis placed on toughness. However, combat arms units are no joke. We have the best, most expensive training in the world, and by far the best equipment. I would not want to be on the other team. Chances are I'd be dead before I even saw an American soldier. My great-grandfather talked to me about being a Canadian in World War II. When a Canadian plane flew overhead, the Germans dove for cover. When a German plane flew overhead, the Canadians dove for cover. When an American plane flew overhead, everybody dove for cover. This will probably be buried, but my great-uncle fought for the Germans in the Battle of Normandy. He said that they were told that the Allies were being pushed back into the sea and that any Allies they saw were most likely small units that had slipped by. A few days later, my great-uncle woke up to find a regiment of Americans camped within sight of the farmhouse they were in. Him and his squad surrendered. I have a girlfriend from Iraq who had brothers in the Iraq army. They defected pretty quick and live here now, but they tell me how insane the American arsenal was. While Iraq soldiers' main method of transport was pickup trucks, motorbikes, and bicycles, the Americans were transporting people in armored personnel carriers that were impossible to damage. Also tells me that the quality of training was noticeable, as you would never see the Americans, you would just be shot because they knew how to move from cover to cover and remain undetected. Her brothers never killed anyone. They defected once troops entered the country. They were only 16 at the time. Yeah, this is the closest I've got to an answer. My family is Panamanian. Being a civilian in a country invaded by US troops is terrifying. Tanks stopped in front of my grandma's house and started firing over it. My cousins were all really young when it happened, and they were absolutely terrified. Unfortunately, I don't have access to someone who may have fought for the dictator at the time that the US was ousting. From Iraq here. My father fought on the defensive lines in Iraq during the Gulf War, when the West forces entered Iraq. He said it was very scary to have planes fly over. You do not see them when they're coming because they're very fast, so damage and death happens with no warning. Planes were followed by soldiers, but he did not get close to them. He said everyone knew the fighting was pointless because Saddam was not a good leader, and he thought he was. Saddam thought he could fight back, but UN had better leaders and more tools. My father told me it was like fighting a bad disease because you don't know what you're fighting and you don't know how to fight it. Not the enemy, but was in communications, and we would get intel from counter-intel guys from intercepted cell phone calls. Talibans would be scared out of their minds when it came to engaging Marines. One report that I remember well was a commander ordering guys to engage in firefights because they wanted to do a show of force. The guy he was ordering gave a million excuses and was scared of the new Marines because they thought they were special forces. We had a bunch of new gear, chest rings, radios, and thermals. They ended up engaging a patrol later that week. We killed most of their cell that day. My great-uncle flew A6M0 Zeke fighter aircraft for the Japanese Imperial Navy. He survived one attack on an American carrier task force but was wounded and relegated to light duty in China. He described the first time seeing the US fleet circa 1944 as both awe-inspiring and extremely disheartening, simply the futility of trying to fight the US. I actually gave a talk on this topic today. Not just the US, but basically on the losing side. I suppose I'd sum it up. The winners write history. I guess the end result of facing an army like the US, a technological monster, is you're not going to be the one writing that history book. Currently in Berlin, and I just get my group, Australia, US, Canada, etc., to imagine no war memorials in their town, no Veterans Day, no Anzac Day, no parades, no walls listing the dead, and then I remind them for a large portion of soldiers here during World War I and II, it wasn't they were evil. It was they were, in their minds, fighting for their home the same as our grandfathers and great-grandfathers. We get to remember our dead soldiers, to raise them up as heroes. Those that lose don't. It's a strange but powerful thing to be allowed to remember. What's the most WTF thing you've experienced or seen during a flight? I travel quite a bit and have seen a few weird things, but on a recent trip from Vienna to Venice, things were taken to a whole new level. So we're about 20 minutes into the flight when I noticed that a woman sitting across from me had a Persian cat in one of those cat carrier bags. The plane was really warm and the cat was sitting in the bag panting. Well, the lady decided to let the cat out of the bag to let it cool off a bit. After trying to shove the cat's face up into the air vents for a minute, the cat literally literally freaked out. It was clawing at everything, attaching itself to the seats in front, jumping around, hissing, well, you name it. This thing went crazy. Anyway, after about 5 minutes of more of the same, the cat completely lost it, tried to climb the seat in front and, wait for it, fell over dead. We couldn't believe what had just happened. The owner was trying to shake the cat around a bit to wake it up, but it was a goner. For the duration of the flight, she was sat there holding her dead cat, sobbing quite profusely. That's just awful. I would be completely paranoid bringing a pet on a plane, and not because of anything like this happening, just in general. On a red-eye flight, just as I fell asleep, a woman passed out in the middle of the aisle and hit my leg. I was so doped up on Dramamine, I didn't even realize it and fell back asleep. The flight attendants put an oxygen tank on the floor and put the tank masks over her mouth. Apparently, they used my hand to hold it in place. So when I woke up a few minutes later, I was like, why am I holding an oxygen mask over someone's face? Hey, you're literally out there helping save lives in your sleep. I was on a Gulf Air, as in Persian Gulf, flight as a kid in the late 80s, and a Pakistani family a few rows behind me in coach lit up a barbecue. It was one of those little portable aluminum foil things. You never heard so many flight attendants scream so loud. Yeah, talk about different times. I walked onto the plane and gave the first steward I saw a bag of Hershey's miniatures. This is for the crew. The whole flight, I was given free headphones and all the free drinks I could handle. I tried to pay, but she just kept giving me my money back with every drink. Apparently, chocolate's very valuable in the air. I was about 15 and flirting with a cute girl in the seat next to me. My family was about 2 rows back with my younger brother, and the lady that occupied the third seat pretty much set me up the entire flight. This old lady was the best wingman ever. Anyway, I get up to use the restroom and she says she has to go too. She gets out first and I'm waiting for her to finish up. We've been flirting pretty much the whole flight and she knows that I'm right behind her in line. So she finishes using the bathroom and I walk in. Right there in the toilet is a gigantic unflushed poop. To this day, I have no idea how you respond to something like that. Not really a WTF moment, but kind of funny. So we're flying out of Cleveland and the pilot comes over the PA and gives his welcome, blah blah blah. So we're just leaving Cleveland, we should be in, And then slightly under his breath, but not quiet enough that everyone else didn't hear, he says, "Where the hell are we going?" Long pause. "Chicago." Everyone laughed. Good times and high times. I sat beside a Scientologist who tried to convince me to go into business with him. He wouldn't explain what the business was. How are you going to ask me to invest if you're not even going to tell me what I'm investing in? Come on, buddy. I was flying to Denver on Delta in winter 2009, and they were switching from cash to credit only. They just got their brand new machines to swipe cards, and I was one of the first people to test them out. I ordered a 7 and 7, and it was $7. She took my card, swiped it, and the thing that printed out was $0. I left a $3 tip and thought, cool. About 10 minutes later, she came by and asked if I wanted another. I said, sure, why not? I swiped the card, and another $0 transaction. Bought lunch, $0. So I ordered 4 more 7 and 7s and got hammered for around $20 in tips. I checked my bank account the day after and sure enough, only the tip showed up. I have no idea what happened, but that was one happy flight attendant. Sounds like you did pretty well for yourself too, my friend. A guy died next to me once. On a flight from Maui to Dallas, I was half asleep in the second to last row of the plane. While I was listening to music and dozing, I suddenly heard a really loud, hard thud next to me. I look over and there's a man lying on the ground, completely still. I thought maybe he tripped, but the flight attendant came running and he was unresponsive. She frantically ran up and down the aisles asking for doctors. Luckily for him, the flight was full of vacationing doctors and nurses. All of them in ridiculous clothes. 2 of the doctors who came back were in Hawaiian shirts and golf attire, and the female nurse who came back was wearing a very strappy, revealing blue Hawaiian print dress. The doctors tried to wake the man up, but he was gone. I was surprised to find out just how much medical equipment they have on commercial flights. The docs whipped out a portable defibrillator and shocked the guy, then set up an IV drip for him. I never heard a word out of him or saw him move. Not sure if he actually woke up or not. Our flight was diverted to LA, and when we landed, half a dozen EMT personnel ran onto the plane to pull the guy out on a gurney. Unfortunately for me, this scenario set off a panic attack, and I had to go find a nice spot in the aisle to lie down so that I didn't pass out and cause more problems for the crew and doctors. It was kind of embarrassing. One time, I was the only person on a very big plane from DC to Atlanta. They told me they wouldn't normally fly, but they really needed the plane in Atlanta first thing in the morning. I got great service, by the way. Since then, I've used this as the setting for an erotic fantasy. An older man unsuccessfully attempting to get some action from his wife in the seat in front of me. Honey, I got the blanket in place. My wife was coming to visit me in Africa a few months ago. On some third world airline, a passenger sitting next to her pulls out his thing and starts peeing into a bottle, then hands it to the stewardess who didn't even bat an eye. I'm sorry, is there no bathroom on the plane? I was in an aisle seat on a flight from LA to Austin, Texas. About an hour into the flight, I noticed this awful smell. I look up from my book just in time to see this 70-year-old woman violently throwing up in her lap. Since I'm a sympathy vomiter, I turn towards the people in the other seats to try and avoid doing the same thing. After about a minute of this and the rancid smell of old people vomit, she's led to the bathroom. As she's leaving her seat, she poops herself in the seat. So I get to spend the rest of the flight gagging as this poop and vomit aroma assaults my nostrils. The flight attendants tried to clean it up as best as they could, but it made no real improvement. Ugh, that's awful to have to sit through, but also just kind of feel bad for that lady. She's obviously having a really rough time. While waiting to use the bathroom on the way to Panama, the door somehow opened while this guy was hunched over the toilet, pleasuring himself. At first, I couldn't believe what I actually saw. As his head turned to see the door come open, the most awkward eye contact moment of my life unfolded. He turned to shut the door in a panicked fashion, exposing his junk. At that point, my WTF face became encrusted into my facial features for the rest of the flight, and even the next day. Ever since that time, I can hardly use any bathroom on a plane. I was taking a business flight to Chicago when, about halfway through the flight, a man was walking back to the lavatory but completely passed out and hit the floor next to me. People started chattering and calling for help while this guy pops out of first class and says, "Don't worry, I'm a doctor," and addresses the situation like a boss. It was Dr. Oz. Oh, great. Is there any other doctor on board? On the way to Japan, I look across the aisle and see an old man sitting with an old woman I assume to be his wife. He reaches into his bag and pulls out a large stash of adult magazines and proceeds to sit and look at them for many hours of the flight. I'm sure he says he just reads them for the articles. I was flying Calgary to Houston, which is about a 4-hour direct flight. We were just about 2 hours into the flight, or coincidentally, just about to Denver, when the pilot announced we would have to turn back to Calgary. So around we go and land in about an hour 15. He really cranked it. We touch down and taxi over to the mechanics. They open the cargo door and shut it again. And in 15 more minutes, we were fueled up and in the air and off to Houston. This time it was about a 3-hour flight, full thrust the whole way. Luckily, there was an industry guy behind me and I overheard him speculating the reason. His idea was that since the airline had paid mechanics in Calgary and probably not in Denver, it would be cheaper for them to turn all the way around to Calgary than pay all the costs associated with landing in Denver. Luckily, it was just a little glitch and not a true problem, but it was anyone's guess the true issue. I have a friend that's familiar with the inner workings of the plane, and he said that anytime they open the cargo door and unplug a certain cable during maintenance, some switch has to be flipped to reset the alarm system for that door. He said it's an extremely common mistake for that switch to not get flipped after work has been done, and it results in false alarms. All that cost, likely in the tens of thousands, because one guy forgot to flip a switch. I'd be more annoyed at the waste of time, honestly. Just land in Denver, come on. On a flight a few weeks ago, the flight attendant started to make preparations for landing, telling people to put their trays up and whatnot. I noticed the flight attendant loudly speaking to a man in his late 20s or early 30s sitting 2 rows in front of me. "Sir, you need to put your seat back up. Sir, sir." The guy starts spitting blood and convulsing. It sounded like he was choking on the blood with each gasp of air. The flight attendant starts screaming for help, and they make an announcement over the PA for a doctor. 4 passengers and all flight attendants leap into action. Turns out, the lady in the row between me and the sick man is a nurse. Together, they get him laid out in the row with his head in the aisle. He's not responding to their questions, and he's fading in and out of consciousness. We make an emergency landing, 20 minutes ahead of schedule. As we're taxiing, he regains consciousness and tells the flight attendant holding his head that he's sorry for the trouble. We land, paramedics meet the plane and carry him off. He seemed to be stable, but I hope everything worked out for the guy. Yeah, that's gotta be a really scary moment for everyone around. Spitting blood and convulsing is not something that you want happening on a plane. This one happened to my cousin. He was flying in South America, and about halfway through the flight, he realizes he really needs to go to the bathroom. The plane he's on is a tiny prop plane made for tiny people. He's 6'5". He awkwardly climbs over his aisle mates and stumbles and shuffles to the back of the plane. As he's closing the door, the captain comes on the loudspeaker and warns of upcoming turbulence. He thinks, screw it, I really need to pee. He crams himself into this tiny bathroom and manages to whip it out. And right as he starts to pee, they hit a huge bit of turbulence that knocks him off his feet, backwards, through the bathroom door, and flat on his back in the aisle, still peeing straight up in the air. He was completely mortified and managed to get back up, pick up the door, and work himself back into the bathroom. He waited for like 20 minutes hoping no one would have seen it or that they would have forgotten about it by then, but when he went back out to take his seat, he got a standing ovation from every single person on the plane. Ouch. I feel like this story might be a little bit embellished, but I like the visuals here. I used to travel internationally a lot when I was younger and working for a telecom company designing new infrastructure. On one of the trips as we were heading to China, I looked out the window. We were above Alaska and bearing straight somewhere, and the horizon had a huge slice of black, like some weird wedge-shaped cloud that encompassed half the horizon. It was a bright day on the ground or sea below us. The ice was very bright and white, but there was this giant dark wedge encompassing and seeming to take over the earth as you looked out to the horizon. I had the guys next to me take a look out as well, and they were confused at first too. I was really confused for a few minutes. Then I realized what I was looking at in profile and what that black engulfing wedge really was. It was night. We were flying in such a manner that we were surfing the edge of daytime and nighttime at 35,000 feet. And at that moment, if you looked out over the horizon, you saw daytime fading into night. I only saw it that once. It was being in the right place at the right time. Aside from bad in-flight movies, that would be my most WTF experience. That sounds like that would be absolutely incredible to see. I'd love to see photos of something like that. I'm sure you could find it on Google. The bathroom sink on a Bangladeshi Airlines flight from Thailand to Nepal was clogged and had about 1,000 water bugs living in it. I was on a plane that lost power just as it was throttling up for takeoff. And I don't mean they reduced power to the engines. I mean all the lights went out, the engines shut down, and we were left sitting on the runway for a good few minutes. Somehow the plane regained power and we taxied to an adjacent tarmac for another few minutes. After this, the pilot announces to the rest of the passengers that they had a small technical glitch and that we're now ready for takeoff. The rest of the ride was uneventful. I mean, yeah, you would want that to be the end of the events. You don't want that happening in the air. I was on a flight home from South Africa after a family vacation. My dad is diabetic, but he usually keeps his blood sugar levels pretty regulated, so I never worried before. Mid-flight, I wake up from a nap and see him slumped over the side of his seat. He was taken to the back of the plane where 3 doctors were examining him. They said his heartbeat went up to 220 or something, which I think means he was about an inch from death. All I remember is seeing my mom and brother break down. I began having flashes of life without my father, and it overwhelmed me. I felt sick to my stomach, imagining what life would be like, when all of a sudden his heart rate stabilized. The doctors on board said that it was a miracle, and I felt so much relief. The plane had to stop in Senegal where my dad was transferred to a hospital. He wanted me to keep going since the semester was starting soon. That flight home alone was terrible. I felt the other passengers watching me the entire time. He's all right now, but every time I get on a plane, I remember that feeling of leaving the whole world behind. I was on a flight from Amsterdam to New York one time, and there was this kid who was running up and down the aisles trying to bite people. As he was heading down the aisle at full speed, a stewardess suddenly pulled the refreshment cart into the aisle right in front of him, and he ran smack into it face first. She said to him, "Oh, sorry, didn't see you coming. You shouldn't run down the aisle like that," or something like that. I know she did that on purpose. It was awesome. Hey, you know what? Someone had to. I went to Vegas with my wife. First, let me say it was an early flight. We got there extra early for check-in, put our bags to the side so as not to get in anyone's way. This 300+ pound greaseball wearing a Hawaiian shirt and shorts comes waddling in with one carry-on bag, remember this as it's important, and knocks over my neatly stacked out-of-the-way baggage. It's also 15 degrees outside, freezing, and 5:15 in the morning. I'm like, whatever, no big deal. Later, we get on the plane. My wife has the window, I'm in the middle, and here comes too fat for the seat Hawaiian guy with his little bag to sit on the end next to me. Great. Believe me when I tell you, this guy smelled like a dead animal covered in throw up and poop. I literally dry heaved when he sat down next to me. The guy had a carry-on bag that he was clenching like it contained something of the utmost importance. Obviously not deodorant. And he was sweating through his thin red flowered shirt while everyone else was bundled in heavy winter jackets. We hadn't even taken off yet, and I was becoming violently ill smelling this guy. I had to stuff my face in my sweater and throw my head into my wife's lap to try and escape the smell. After an hour, the guy became increasingly fidgety and paranoid. This made him sweat more. I can't figure out how a guy who sweated so much was so fat. He was like a walking sauna of used banana hammocks. Finally, the guy got up to use the bathroom, and as soon as he closed the bathroom door, people began ripping cologne and perfume ads out of magazines and rubbing them on his sweat-soaked chair. I kid you not. People were offering their apologies to me for having to sit next to him. And then the stewardess comes over and says, "I'm sorry, the flight is booked. There's nowhere else to put him." And I'm staring at her like, what? I never even said anything to anyone about it. That's when I realized this guy was such a disgusting mess. People were actually rallying around trying to help me. It was the weirdest moment of my life. For the next 5 hours, he made about 20 more trips to the bathroom, and each time, different rows would come over to rub his seat down with cologne. Oh, and guess what was in the bag? Adult magazines. Piles of adult magazines. He took a new one to the bathroom with him each time. I haven't been on a plane since. Yeah, that's gotta be just about the worst person you'd have to sit next to on an airplane. I was on a flight to Chicago. We were supposed to land at O'Hare, but about 30 minutes before landing, they told us it was too icy and we were diverted to Midway. The two are about 26 miles apart. So we land at Midway, we disembark, and as we're leaving the Skyway, a gate agent runs up and tells us we need to get back on the plane. They were now going to take us to O'Hare. We all said, screw it, we'll stay here. She then informed us our bags wouldn't be getting unloaded. We would need to go to the other airport to get them. So about 5 of us out of a full flight of 90 got back on and had to wait about 20 minutes to de-ice the plane, then a 15-minute flight to O'Hare. From the flyer's point of view, this just seems like a complete waste of time. I get that they must need the plane at that airport for something, but come on. Everyone's already deboarded, you got a few people left, just roll with it. The die has been cast. Not my story, but my sister's. She was once on a long-haul flight from London to Hong Kong. During the night, while everyone was sleeping, suddenly a woman let out the most blood-curdling scream. Since this wasn't long after 9/11, everyone was pretty on edge as it was. It turned out that the woman had just had a bad dream. Everyone was pretty annoyed after that. Hey, come on, it's not her fault. She has no control over that. I get that you guys would be annoyed, but come on, give her a break.
Therapists of Reddit. What was your "you must be kidding me" moment? Some of these are gross. Doctor I used to work with told me about a woman who tried to kill herself, so they put her in a safe room. She then proceeded to try and overdose on water, which he told me is possible, but really hard to do. A client was going to probate court and thought he'd dress up by putting a non-slip sock on his collar as a tie. Trying to be supportive, I told him, "Nice tie," to which he replied, "It's not a tie, it's a sock, stupid." One client of mine bites and eats his fingernails. Gross, but not unheard of. Then I learned he stores his fingernails in a box in his room to save them for a snack later. A little grosser, but he's about 9, so I'm hoping he will grow out of it. What finally made me want to vomit was learning that when anyone in his family clips their nails, fingers or toes, they give him the clippings to add to his box. So when he's eating nails from the box, they could belong to his mother, father, or siblings. Yes, I've addressed the parents about enabling this behavior, but it is still happening. Edit, thank you for all your concerns for my client. I'm aware that it seems like pica or some sort of nutrition deficiency, and for all I know, it could be. I'm a behavioral therapist and not qualified to professionally recommend medical treatments to the family. I do know his parents have taken him to several doctors for multiple different tests for disorders, so this could have been addressed and they just chose not to disclose the information to me. I used to work with children that have autism and Down syndrome, which means a lot of play therapy. I had my moment when one of my clients wanted to sit on my lap while we practiced reciting animal cards, followed with their corresponding noise. Forgot what animal noise I made that made him laugh so much that he ended up peeing on me from the laughter. That night was also date night. Intake clinician here. What brings you in today? I'm here for adult image addiction. At this point, not the weirdest thing I've heard. Let's go with that. Okay, tell me about it. I watch it 3 times a week, for 15 minutes or so at a time. My girlfriend said I'm an addict and forced me to come in. I see lots of very extreme cases, but this was so minor that it made me stop for a moment. I sent them to couples counseling. Just today, I conducted a threat assessment on the first grader who told his teacher he wanted to stab himself with a knife and die. Upon further questioning, he revealed that he and Dad watched The Walking Dead together, and last time on the show, he saw 2 people stab themselves to death because, quote, they didn't want to get eaten by the zombies. Why are you even watching that show with a 6-year-old? Had a client who we found out was storing his own poop under his bed. He would then eat his poop for a snack. Edit, so I guess I should have added why he did this. First issue, he thought he was an alien, so eating his poop had a few benefits in his mind. First benefit, we could not study his poop. Second benefit, he felt that alien poop had nutrients he could not get from our food. He would eat normal food, but we found out he felt Earth food was poison and alien poop fixed that. Third benefit, alien poop is worth a lot of money, so he did not want us to steal it. When we found out what he was doing, I got to inform him that we were taking away his poop. He kicked me. Obligatory, not a therapist, but my hyperconservative parents sent me to an addiction therapist because they found out I smoked pot occasionally in high school. The therapist they chose was a former White House drug czar, a renowned authority on cocaine addiction and hard drug abuse, and an expert on rehabilitating extreme problem cases. My parents must have spent a fortune and pulled strings to get me an appointment. The first session, he asked me what drugs I use. I told him I smoke pot like once a week, and that was it. After a few rounds of, come on, you can trust me, and we can't begin treatment until you admit your problem, he realizes that I really do only smoke pot once in a while, and literally says, "You've got to be kidding me. Tell your parents you're a normal teenager and you don't need to come back." One that sticks out in my mind was a mother that brought in her 5-year-old for therapy because she was into Disney princesses, which are clearly sexual, and since a 5-year-old is non-sexual, this must clearly mean she's being inappropriately abused by a close family member. I've also worked with countless couples who have come to counseling for adultery, wherein adultery equals adult images. One client even became suicidal because she caught her husband pleasuring himself after not screwing him for months. I know everyone has different values, but come on, y'all. Friendly reminder that if you enjoyed this content, hit subscribe and like the video. It really does help. And also, subscribe to Am I the Jerk, linked in the description below. Thanks for watching, and remember to drink some water too. I was working surveillance one night at a psych ward, keeping a close watch on a mentally ill patient. Right before my shift started, I was briefed that the patient had started eating one of the light bulbs and attacked a nurse. At around 5 a.m., he woke up and saw me sitting there at the end of his bed. I said good morning, and he didn't reply. About 15 minutes of silence went by before he stood up, stared out the window, and said, "A person is most vulnerable when taking a crap." I didn't sit back down for the rest of my shift. Social work. Not therapy, but close enough. Me. We need to think of some new ways for you to discipline your daughters other than spanking. Client. But my parents did it to me, and I turned out okay. Me. Stares at this high school dropout drug addict who has spent his entire adult life in and out of jail/halfway houses, can't get a job, and has had his 3 kids removed for abuse and neglect. Okay. I actually did successfully turn this around in a gentle way and make him realize he hadn't actually, quote, turned out okay. I had a client, an older female refugee that I worked with for several months before she told me that she had court the next week and was worried because she could be deported if found guilty. She didn't tell me earlier because she was ashamed and suffered in silence. She was living with extended family, and the family got busted for smuggling and selling khat, a stimulant narcotic. The family determined that she would take the fall for her husband and sons who were behind the operation. At the arrest, the police brought an interpreter for a different language from a different ethnic group in a different country than the client was from. On top of that, she said the police didn't have an interpreter present during the questioning at the station, and she waited there for almost 2 days until they found an interpreter for her language. I asked her if she understood what was happening, and she said her lawyer, public defendant she met once, told her she would be deported. Beyond that, she had no understanding of the situation, process, etc. I had seen her psych evaluation stating that she had the cognitive equivalent of a 7-year-old. So I told her that we have information that could help her case and that her lawyer should see it as soon as possible. This was on a Friday, court was on Wednesday, and the client didn't know the name or any information about her public defender. We got a friend to help her collect the information. The client brought it to me on Monday, signed the ORI. Lawyer called me back that afternoon saying they've got nothing to help this poor woman even though the case seems appropriately set up. I told the lawyer that we've got a whole bunch of insight and data and records that will get the charges dropped. I didn't work Tuesdays and was going nuts worrying and hoping everything would get to where it needs to and in the hands of the people who need to see it. On Wednesday, news from court comes that all charges were dropped. I used to get all kinds of things sprung on me at the last minute, then have to perform all kinds of bureaucratic trapeze maneuvers to alter the outcome of high-stakes situations. I wrote so many letters. I was hired to be a mental health provider, but I ended up doing tons of case management because nobody else wanted to. Have a master's in clinical psychology and currently working towards my doctorate. I laughed reading this question because I feel like I have at least one of those moments per day at my clinic rotations, regardless of type of setting. One that stood out the most was when I was working a camp for children with various psychological disorders, most with some sort of behavioral concerns. The girl I was paired with had a history of aggressive and violent tendencies. We went the whole day without any problems. That was, until we were doing some group physical activity to wind down and focus before leaving for the day. She didn't like that this meant no longer playing with a certain toy, so she took off her shoe and threw it at the little boy in front of her. He had autism and immediately started crying and screaming. While someone helped him, I turned to the girl to explain to her what she did was wrong. As I turned towards her, she punched me square in the face, then grabbed a hold of my hair. Managed to pull out a good chunk. I'm about 5'1", and this girl was maybe 1 or 2 inches shorter than me and had about 20 pounds on me, despite being 9 years old. Trying to get a safe physical restraint was difficult and comical to say the least. Finally got some help from other staff, and we were able to calm her down after about 15 minutes. The kicker was, when we told her mom what happened, she basically dismissed the entire thing and laughed about it. So frustrating, because you know this kind of thing is reinforced at home as there is no punishment. The girl then starts hitting her mom, who grabs and holds down her arms. The little girl laughs, looks at me, and the other staff member, and says, "Ugh, a little help over here? Are you going to let her do this to me? She's hurting my arm." I went home and did this weird laugh/cry for a few hours. Luckily, you learn pretty quickly not to take things personally and move on, so things were back to normal the next day. I do occasionally look back at that day just baffled at how quickly that whole situation escalated. Most of the other moments that come to mind involve poop in some capacity. I work in a community residence for adults with mental illness. Most of them are very capable and independent. One girl, 27 years old, constantly acts really dumb for sympathy and will do dumb things because she can, I guess. First week she was admitted, she tripped on something getting out of bed. She's 5'1" and like 200 pounds. and she fell on her foot and broke some of the small bones in the foot. I take her to get her cast, and she gets the usual don't get the cast wet, use your crutches, elevate, blah blah blah. Since her bedroom was on the second floor, we had to send her back to her mother's house for a few weeks since she would not be able to exit the building in time in case of emergency. Well, 5 days later, the shoe/boot thingy to put over your cast comes in, and we call her up saying we'll bring it over. Her response? Well, I don't think it'll fit. Why not, we ask. Because I cut my cast off. I got it wet, and it was too tight. They didn't give her a second cast, and she never used her crutches, claiming they were unstable and she would fall and get hurt if she used them. Her foot never healed properly, and 2 months later, she fell and broke it again. Edit, since you all have questions. She didn't get a second cast because A, she would have to pay for it herself and she didn't have the money, and B, doctors did not want to give her another plaster cast, fearing she would just cut that off too. Other options for a cast insurance wouldn't cover. Number 2. Yes, being 5'1" and 200 pounds is severely overweight. Many times, people with mental health issues come from low-income backgrounds. Often, people with mental illness are overweight due to lack of good health care and know-how to lose weight themselves. Number 3. I can tell she acts stupid on purpose for several reasons. Mostly that when she thinks we're not watching, she slips up and behaves normally and makes actual intelligent decisions. Also, she's told us she thinks guys like her more if she's stupid, and she gets lots of sympathy from people for how stupid she is. Number 4. To the person who said she might likely lose the foot, she's told us she wants her foot amputated because then it wouldn't hurt so much. Logic. My client told me his family didn't appreciate his interest in guns, to which he proceeded to tell me he is always carrying. He then places his gun on the table in front of me and asked if it made me nervous. It did, but we focused more about why he wanted to know if I was nervous, and I brought it back around to his family. From then on, I made sure to always have access to a door and never put the client between the door and myself again, just to be safe. This recently happened to me. I have a client who is a daily methadone doser. During our last session, he complained of sleep issues. Delving into this new issue, he described his solution to me. He saves his spit in a jar to drink at night when he is unable to sleep. Saves his spit in a jar to drink later. I'm a therapist and have a few of these stories, but this story was actually told to me by a therapist friend of mine. He said that he was working in a mental hospital a few years ago, and he and other staff had heard a loud scream from down the hall. They ran to go check it out and got to a patient's room to see blood all over his face and hand, and realized he had torn his own eyeball out. They tried to defuse the situation and start looking around for the eyeball. They couldn't find it. He had eaten his own eyeball. Edit, I don't know the reason the patient gave for eating and or removing his eye, but I will say it takes a pretty severe level of psychosis for a person to be able to do this. Honestly, he was probably more concerned about the quote reason he needed to take his eye out than he was with the pain of it. I can't imagine the emotional pain he must have been going through to be able to get to this point. Worked one summer at a summer school for special needs children about 2 years ago when I was 14. I was just a teacher's aide, so most of what I was doing was playing with the lower maintenance children and just running errands for the teachers. One morning, I was helping the kids put their stuff into their cubbies, and one of the kids was just standing in front of his, staring at me with his lunch bag in his hands. This was one of the more violent kids who would act up at the slightest of breezes. He was about 11 or 12 and had severe autism. I asked him if he needed help putting his stuff away, and he replied with only some mumbling. I asked him to speak clearly, and he said, "I'm going to hurt you." I was really confused and asked him to repeat what he said. He then screamed at the top of his lungs, "I'm going to hurt you!" and swung his lunchbox straight for my head. Luckily, I kinda expected this thing to happen, so I was ready to duck, and he missed. I was not allowed to even touch any of the students because I was not trained to restrain them, so until the teachers got him under control, all I could do was run around the classroom as he chased me. Once the teachers restrained him, he was under control within about 10 or 15 minutes. When the teacher asked him why he did what he did, he said that he was angry because his dad didn't bring him to Denny's that morning. I was assaulted because a kid didn't get to go to Denny's. Quite common, actually. Anything outside the normal routine, and they have a meltdown. My son is autistic, and when he was younger, he'd have an absolute meltdown when the seasons changed. For the winter months, he'd obviously put on his winter jacket, hat, and gloves. Once spring came, I gave him a light coat one morning and he fell to the ground crying and screaming because he thought he wasn't going to school. Tough days, let me tell you. Thankfully, he has amazing teachers and support, and my biggest problem now is he takes his socks off at night and throws them on the side of his huge bunk bed that I can't move. So, typical annoying kid stuff now. Forensic therapist here. I work with paroled sex offenders. One time, a guy I worked with urinated on my coworker's car in broad daylight. She was in the car. He made eye contact with her while he was doing it. His PO picked him up from group 20 minutes later. He's currently having a little vacation at a state facility. When I worked in bereavement, a client of mine used the term, quote, skid marks when discussing the accident. For some reason, there and then, the expression just caught me off guard. I joined the dots, and the corners of my mouth started to rise. In actuality, this may have only lasted a moment, but it felt like minutes, all the while I was drawing blood as I chewed down on the insides of my cheeks. I felt like the worst human being alive. Was running an addiction treatment group. Some of the participants were referred by the court, usually for a DUI. The referral conditions were simple. If they finished treatment, they would not serve time in jail for the DUI. One of these court-referred DUI participants ran a limo service and showed up to group with a tablet and cell phone. He spread things out and proceeded to treat the space as his personal office. I intervened, explaining he would not be able to conduct business while participating in the group. He gave me a look that would have killed an ordinary person, said it was a busy time of year and he really needed to stay in touch with his drivers. I told him I understood, but he still needed to put the stuff away and pay attention. Lots of eye rolling, I can't believe this lady, and he still kept checking his phone and getting up to go outside and take calls. During the break, I told him his behavior was disruptive and he would have to leave. This seemed to make him happy, until I added I will be telling the judge he did not complete treatment. For the first time, he seemed to slowly realize he was there for a reason and might actually end up in jail because of his behavior. He apologized and asked to stay, and he settled down after that. Had a patient who swallowed things as a self-injuring behavior. This individual would swallow anything metal and pointy, usually as a way of getting into the hospital or to stay in the hospital. At one point, they wanted to get surgeries or procedures to have the objects removed, but they didn't actually want to die. One instance where they almost died after ingesting a series of closed safety pins that ended up opening inside their stomach stopped them from eating things that wouldn't pass. Anyway, so this person was upset that they were getting discharged as they wanted to stay until the beginning of the month. Hate to say it, but it's not uncommon to see people come in because they are out of benefits for the month. The usual complaints of wanting to die weren't working because we know this person doesn't actually want to die. So they went and swallowed the iron from the Monopoly game. It didn't work, we still discharged them, but ever since then, we haven't been allowed to have board games on the unit without staff supervision. Had a client who was told he absolutely had to start losing weight else he would become troublingly diabetic and begin losing appendages. He didn't put much effort in, eventually having his foot amputated. Time after time I saw him, I had to explain that having a foot amputated did not count as half a stone towards his weight loss targets. He was genuinely mortified. Had a patient once with auditory hallucinations. They suddenly decided I was, quote, the voice, and they had to do whatever I said. So, I encouraged them to do positive things for others, and always be nice to their mother. You know, now I actually am curious. If there's anybody listening to these videos out there with schizophrenia, how does that affect you? Did the voices affect you in a positive way? Do they tell you to do positive things? Or are these hallucinations always negative? Let me know in the comments. I was working with a woman who had struggled with alcohol throughout her life and during her pregnancies. She denied drinking while pregnant, but 2 of her children were born with fetal alcohol syndrome. She was seeing me in session to process her reaction to receiving letters from her children that basically called her out for being a bad mom and saddling them with the disease because she drank. She was really defensive and said, I don't know why they're mad at me, because everyone knows you get fetal alcohol syndrome from the dad. Not sure if deflecting or just that uninformed. It was pretty memorable when a histrionic patient leapt onto my desk so I could better appreciate her new sneakers. College Redditors, what's the one high school habit each incoming freshman needs to stop doing on their first day of college? I'll start. No longer are you required to raise your hand and ask to use the restroom. Just get up and leave quietly. Don't wear shirts with your high school name, graduation date, class motto, etc. If you sit in the front row with the laptop, actually pay attention. Do not use Facebook, Reddit, or play Tetris. If you're sick, you don't need a note from your parents. Don't eat loud food in class. Please, please, please follow this one. Don't talk loudly in class. People are there to learn. Keep your high school GPA, sports accomplishments, SAT/ACT scores, and awards to yourself. No one cares. Oh, you were in an AP class? No one cares. You were popular in high school? No one cares. You were a nerd in high school? No one cares. You think your professor is a jerkwad? No one cares. You were prom king? No one cares. In essence, don't take yourself too seriously. Approach college with a sense of humbleness. Don't boast too much about your old self in high school. For the record, when they say no one cares, they don't mean that none of that matters or is worth nothing. It just means that it's not going to affect the friends you make or the activities you participate in. For me, at least, college was a time where I really started to come out of my shell. High school doesn't matter anymore, despite all my dreams taking place there. Your life isn't over if you walk into class late. Just calmly go in and take a seat. You'll be fine. Yes, it will be on the test. After a test, you don't have to stick around. Pack your stuff up and leave quietly. If you're struggling, don't wait to get help. Seriously, if your school is halfway decent, there's at least one other resource outside of your professor that you can consult for tutoring. You will regret letting your pride and/or laziness get in the way of passing a class. Finally, if professors offer to read rough drafts of papers, send or take them a rough draft. Not only will you get suggestions tailored to your professor's grading tendencies, but your professor is also aware that they told you your paper is fine, quote, except for. So if they said that one paragraph looked fine and then realized later it should have been expanded on in some detail, they will probably be more lenient. You sought help, they missed it. Oh well. Besides, you'll become a much better writer hearing suggestions from multiple sources. My essay writing has improved significantly because of my professor's input. Edit. So, I forgot this was about habit breaking. Here's a habit to break, so I'm actually answering a question. Don't sleep in class or otherwise ignore your professor. The lectures generally emphasize what your professor thinks is most important and what will be stressed on your tests. Besides, they usually have funny or interesting stories that revolve around the topic. It's fun stuff. Edit 2. Since it seems to be getting mentioned a lot, there are instances in which you do stay after the exam. I suspect, however, your professor will mention it in those circumstances. If in doubt, just ask the professor beforehand. Making up excuses to a professor if you miss the due date for an assignment. It isn't that they aren't listening, it's that they simply will not care. Stop being so embarrassed when your family phones you or comes over. They probably live very far away and came here to see you. Show them some love. Professor here. Number 1. Don't plagiarize. We'll catch you. If we do, fess up. The first several times, the student said, I don't know how that happened. Remember that uncommon knowledge should be cited. Number 2. If the prof asks you to come in for help, do it. We can't help you if you don't. Number 3. I can't tell you how many, quote, smart kids have dropped out. If you get so behind that you feel overwhelmed, talk to someone, anyone, and everyone until you get back on track. You may need professional help. Number 4. Get involved. The more connected you are, the better you'll do. Number 5. Live on campus if you can. Why? See number 4. Number 6. You'll get some great professors and some crappy ones, no matter what school you go to. If all of them are great, let me know and I'll put my application in. I'm not being egotistical. I just don't like having uncomfortable conversations with students about their bad professors. Also, who one student feels is awful may end up being your favorite. Number 7. Take advantage of electives. Try something you may never get to try again. No more raw dogging it. Please wear a condom. This may seem kind of random and out of the blue, but seriously, college campuses are one of the easiest ways to get STDs. There's no shame in nabbing a free condom if there's a table giving them away. The worst habit you can get into is not being safe. You definitely need to study. If you had it easy in high school, it likely will not be that way in college. Putting your phone on vibrate is not the same as putting your phone on silent. Everyone can hear your phone buzz. Everyone can also see you texting during lecture. Hiding your phone under your desk fools no one. Putting on makeup in the middle of class? No one cares anymore. Some people just drag themselves out of bed wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants. I actually have a couple tips about this. Number 1. In my acting classes, it was actually standard to wear comfortable clothing like sweatpants and t-shirts. We do a lot of posing, stretching, laying on the floor, etc., so it was important to wear something that you could actually move in. Tip: if you're signing up for an exercise, acting, or dance class, read the syllabus. It is your professor's Bible. Number 2. I was a soundboard operator for a play that had a morning performance, and I ended up waking up about 5 minutes before showtime, so I had no time to get ready. I bolted to the building in my oversized t-shirt and bright red flannels, did my job, and went back to my dorm. Tip: be sure to set your alarm. And also, nobody cares about what you're wearing. I've seen people in class with rainbow He-Man t-shirts on. It's all part of the experience. Stop checking Facebook every 3 seconds. It's amazing how much time it will free up for you. Don't shout out snide comments during class trying to get people to laugh. We don't care if that's what she said. We just want to learn. Here's a tip. After you subscribe to Am I the Genius and Am I the Jerk, linked in the description below, don't watch us during class. But you do get brownie points for liking the video and turning on notifications. Thanks for watching. Number 1. Be ready to change your major if you need to. What you actually do in a given field of study is often radically different than what you'd imagine. Had a friend go into physics, spent the last 2 years of his degree programming simulations. Switch early enough, and you won't have too many headaches. Number 2. You can sneak into other classes. No one is going to stop or even notice you. Do this a lot, and you'll eventually be able to talk about just anything. Number 3. Use the library. Steal from databases. Outside of college, knowledge is expensive and libraries are sorely underfunded. Number 4. Most clubs are kind of BS. Attend anyway. Catch a couple club members outside of the meetings, get a couple drinks in with them, and you'll probably get something closer to what you were looking for. Number 5. Even if you're living off of your folks, if you can swing a part-time job, get one. Having a bit of scratch makes having a social life a lot easier, and it's going to stay that way after you graduate, regardless of how cozy you are. Having a social life makes having an intellectual/professional life a lot easier too. The right friends can do wonders for your academic performance. Number 1. Make as many friends as possible. Number 2. Introduce yourself to your professors. You go from number 8675309 to name. Number 3. No one is in a clique anymore. If they are, screw them. Number 4. If you aren't going to pay attention in class, don't disrupt your classmates with internet conversations or texting. 4.5. Professors can easily pick out people not paying attention and will most likely assume that you do not care about your grade. Number 5. Don't fall victim to no more parents, no more rules, especially on food. Number 6. Going home ain't nothing, but keeping in contact with your parents is. Number 7. Find stuff to involve yourself in, but don't involve in all the things. Number 8. You will meet a crap load of people. Even if you don't like them, don't burn the bridge. Number 9. There will always be someone smarter than you. Don't play know-it-all. Maybe not a habit, but a lesson. And I'm sorry if this is a bit negative or heartbreaking. There will be classes that, no matter how hard you try, you will be terrible with. I enrolled as an aerospace major because I wanted to change the world, despite being more of a history/English person. I, by some miracle, passed my second calculus class with a D. I had absolutely no hope with my third calculus class. I had a tutor, I went to study sessions, I went to office hours, I was housed with engineers. But at that point, nothing could teach me how to get from point A to point B. It was basically magic, with some loose logic here and there. I failed that class, despite all my effort. I'm not saying that you will also fail, but that there will be classes that will be nearly impossible to ace. It's very difficult to get all-around A's. But maybe that's just my engineering school. Here, the engineering average GPA is just over 2.0, I believe. And, no exaggeration, the average math test score is 50% or below, so curving is completely necessary. And always check the class average before you panic and wait for the curve. I got a 23 out of 100 on my Calc 2 exam once. The class average was a 10 out of 100. My 23% became an A. You're going to class, not the club. Alternatively, to those same students about 2 months later, you're going to class, not to bed. Giving a crap about what your peers think about you, and having opinions about your peers based on trivial things like whether or not they wear their varsity jacket. But stop asking random people for a piece of gum when they take it out of their bag. Get your own gum. Try not to screw up your grades your first year or you spend the next 3+ trying to make up for it. Also, get involved, but don't overdo it. Not everyone can be involved in and the president of every organization on campus, but try something. Don't just go to class and then screw around in your room. Buy into the whole college experience, please. No, it's totally true. The first year is the easiest to screw up. I spent more time worrying about a particular extracurricular and the fact that suddenly there were parties, tiny high school, barely any social life, and my grades really suffered. Every semester after the first 2, I got better and better grades, but they ruined the pretty average score overall. Can confirm I bombed my first semester, but every semester after that just got better and better. As long as you have people around you to support you, something as new and scary as college won't be as scary. Don't bother sucking up to the professors. While in high school nobody liked teachers' pets, being one could legitimately give you an advantage. In college, you are one of thousands of students that your professor sees daily. If you become the classic suck-up, you're probably not going to be well liked by your classmates, and the professor will just see you as one out of many students, or, worst case scenario, as a bothersome jerk. Don't be afraid of asking your professor anything you don't understand. While they're held to a much higher standard than your normal teachers, they're still human. That doesn't mean you should interrupt them in the middle of a lecture. What I'm saying is that there's nothing wrong going to the professor after class to clear up your doubts. Expect failure. It doesn't matter if you're smart or even a genius. You're going to a whole different environment. It really is a whole new world you're entering, and getting used to it can be tough for some. The world won't end if you get a C on your first test, so chill. For the love of Godzilla, do not call them anything other than professor. Don't call them Mr., don't call them teach, or anything of the sort. Sidebar, this really does depend on the professor. A lot of the professors at my college were on a first-name basis. That's what I love so much about my campus's theater department. Let's go! One last thing. If you're doing any sort of illegal activity, trust no one. I'm not kidding here. Some people will gladly rat you out. Maybe they're prudes that are jealous of you, or maybe they're against what you're doing. Be completely sure you trust who you're hanging out with. You have no idea how many headaches this will avoid. Not giving a crap. I didn't give a crap throughout high school and graduated with the 1 point something or another. I had no intention of going to college. Spent 10 years in the workforce. Made nothing of myself. Job hopped every year. The last job I had was the longest. I worked there for 2 years. I was up for a promotion that was then given to a guy 6 months my junior because he had a degree. At that point, I quit my job and enrolled in community college. The university wouldn't take me. I have recently transferred to said university and I'm currently maintaining a 3.92 GPA, all because I finally decided to give a crap. If you have a minor disagreement with a professor or find what they're saying is just so interesting, save it for after class. The rest of us really don't give a crap. We just want to get the notes, do the classwork, get the homework, unless it's in the syllabus, and go the heck home. Don't drag us into it. It's boring, and we don't care. And sometimes the professors like to drag the rest of the class into the discussion. Edit, this doesn't apply to discussion-based classes or situations where the professor is outright wrong or inappropriate. Learn to not start a conversation with, "So what's your major?" or at least learn to phrase it differently. Personal pet peeve? Maybe. Do every bit of extra credit offered. If you can redo a bad test for extra points, do it. If you can earn extra points for volunteering at some weird event, do it. If you get extra credit for attending every class session, go to every class session. Use every advantage they give you because every single extra point counts. I'm old and back in school, but as an example, in one of my classes, I did so much extra credit that I only needed a 20% on the final to get an A in the class. That knowledge is incredibly valuable when you have 3 other finals the same week. Send thank you notes/emails to the professors you love, the ones that have made a difference or have gone out of their way to help you. Send it after the class is over and you've received your final grade to avoid impropriety, but do it and be heartfelt about it. They not only appreciate it, but at some point, you may need a reference letter if you're transferring or going on to grad school. I have 2 former professors that will stop me on campus to ask how I'm doing and offer help if I need it. Never forget reference pages. Cite everything you've looked at, even if you're not quoting or using statistics from it, and if needed, buy an APA extension for Word if you suck at formatting. Do not forget references ever. Do not take college like it's on autopilot. It isn't set up for you like high school. You set up your classes, professors, and schedule. Take advantage. Screen your classes and professors so you're not walking into stuff blind. If you end up with a crappy professor or class, you're doing it wrong. Rate My Professor is a beautiful resource. Use it. Also, ask around for recommendations from other students. Your opponent in class is stupid bullcrap. Don't take professors that are jerks or make their class hard just for the sake of doing it. If it's a class that doesn't pertain to your major, find the easy prof and take their class. Bank your easy A for GPA support. If it's a major-related class, get good professors whose classes are only as hard as they need to be. I dissent from the advice here about not being a teacher's pet. I suggest it. Don't kiss up, but take excuses to have sidebar conversations with your professors. Geek out with them. They will think more positively of you, and it can show up in your grade. Not all professors in college grade on purely mathematical formula. As someone who grades a lot of papers and essays, please let me urge you, do not, I repeat, do not fall into the crowd that sets up, quote, teams for classes. I see this all the time, where people say, okay, I'll go Monday, you go Wednesday, etc., and share notes. You are paying to go to class, so go to class. There are a lot of people who do this and get away with it, but you will very likely end up hurting yourself in the long run. You might hurt yourself in the way of not doing as well on a test because your friend didn't take the best notes, in the way of not preparing in a prerequisite class for a later class down the road, or you may be violating the school's academic integrity code. I just want to take a quick second to address that last one because it's very important, and I think a lot of the people who screw up simply didn't take it seriously. Most universities have a zero-tolerance policy for cheating. You may think you're getting away with it, but I want to warn you, teachers/professors do not need to tell you when you're caught. You can go the whole semester thinking you're safe, then suddenly get a nasty letter informing you that you need to go see the Academic Affairs Council. At that point, you are almost certainly hosed, and penalties are usually as severe as possible to use as an example. Please do not underestimate this. It's a lot more serious than high school. Furthermore, if you are farther along in your studies, you can permanently blacklist yourself in the world of academia, potentially losing job opportunities or the ability to go to grad school, which is becoming increasingly necessary. Stop thinking that you're the smartest kid around. You might have been the valedictorian of your high school or whatever, but just because you were the smartest kid there doesn't mean that you're the smartest kid in college. Chances are, everyone else at the school is just as smart as you, if not smarter. Also, don't skip on homework/studying. I was one of those students in high school that rarely did his homework, and I still got good enough grades based on exams that I never had to study for. But in college, those assignments tend to count for a much bigger part of your grade, and most of the time, that homework is going to be much more helpful than high school homework. If you skip the homework, you're likely to have no idea what's going on. As for studying, the exams are much more difficult, and for some classes, the only grades you get are test grades. Mess up on the midterm? Well, you're screwed, since the only other grade is the final. You can't afford to do poorly on one exam, since there's rarely more assignments to buffer your grade. Don't see your professors as, quote, teachers. And in no way do I mean that they're not those who teach, but I mean the fact that, at least for me and many I know, throughout your school career so far, the teachers have been viewed as these much older, almost untouchable people who have this huge status over you. Once I got into college, however, every professor I've had has been very approachable about everything. It feels like talking to an actual human being versus someone who could ruin your life by a single word or sentence. TLDR, don't be afraid to talk to your professors like a normal person. Do not buy your books until you know you are going to use them. I have been swindled one too many times by professors that put expensive textbooks on their required reason lists and never reference them. Along those same lines, never buy textbooks for the campus bookstore. It is ever so much cheaper to order them from Amazon or some similar site. In addition, don't crap on majors that you view as useless or pointless. Telling people, what are you gonna do with X degree? Make coffee? Is not a good way to make friends. Yeah, I've literally had professors be like, hey, I found the textbook you need for this class online as a free PDF, and I'm sending it to the entire class so you don't have to spend $100 on textbooks. Here you go. Those professors are so goated. I love them so much. Thank you. History buffs of Reddit, what is one of the most fascinating stories you've learned that no one seems to talk about and can't be found in textbooks? The Lake Peigneur disaster. Until 1980, Lake Peigneur was a small-ish freshwater lake with a maximum depth of about 10 to 15 feet, located in southern Louisiana. Locals mostly used it for trout fishing, and it also had a canal running 10 miles from the lake southward to the Gulf of Mexico. The main industry of the area was a massive salt mine that stood below the ground, partially underneath the lake itself. Thing is, natural salt deposits like this often coincide with oil reserves, so it wasn't out of the ordinary when oil companies came searching. In November of 1980, Texaco had set up a rig in the lake and was doing some exploratory drilling, hoping to make bank. Little did they know that one of their triangulation coordinates was slightly off, and so they had incorrectly guessed the location of the salt mine below their feet. Their drill bit punched into the roof of the salt deposit about 400 feet earlier than expected, and water began to drain slowly into the salt. And what happens when salt meets water? It dissolves. As the water dissolved more and more salt, it made more and more room for water to be sucked down, which in turn dissolved more salt and made more room, setting off a massive chain reaction. The oil rig on the surface keeled to the side and collapsed, its workers barely escaping before the water pressure became too much to swim through. The remnants of the rig were sucked into the bottom of the lake in what had turned from a tiny hole to a whirlpool, the force of the water shearing away soil and making a bigger hole as it went. The salt mine at the time was fully staffed with workers 1,500 feet below the ground, who were going about their daily shifts in the mine without any knowledge of the events taking place above them until they saw water dripping through the roof of the tunnels. Thanks to well-rehearsed evacuation plans, none of them died before the mine was flooded, but water is just about the worst thing you can see in a salt mine. The whirlpool on the surface, having eaten the rig, began to suck down the entire contents of the lake itself, including 11 barges, various small boats, and yes, the poor trout. The whirlpool grew into a maelstrom, its pressure increasing and in turn building more pressure by creating a bigger and bigger hole, eroding more and more of the salt mine. As it pulled down the entire lake, the water began to shear away at the shores, creating landslides and tearing trees out by the roots. Many of Jefferson Island's 100-year-old pecan trees were lost to the maelstrom, along with several local homes that sat on the shore of the lake and were ripped out by the foundation. The local botanical gardens was destroyed entirely as the soil underneath it was eroded in the span of only a few hours. Compressed air inside the mine finally exploded out through the mine shafts, quickly followed by a 400-foot geyser erupting from the mine's entrance. Not only did Lake Peigneur drain entirely into the mine, dragging 64 acres of destroyed land with it, but the pressure was so great that it also reversed the direction of the Descommes Canal. The ocean water from the Gulf of Mexico rushed northward through the canal to fill the Peigneur Basin, temporarily creating the largest waterfall in Louisiana. The chaos didn't end until the pressure equalized about a week later. When things had finally calmed down, the lake had changed drastically. Its maximum depth was now about 200 feet, as opposed to its previous 10. Its shoreline had expanded, chimneys sticking straight out of the water where the houses had once been. 9 out of the 11 barges claimed by the maelstrom floated back to the surface, although 2 remained somewhere in the ground below. The botanical gardens were gone, and many of the local trees. The salt mine was temporarily shut down, and although it did reopen, it was finally closed permanently in 1986. Texaco had to pay $32 million to the salt company and a further $13 million to the gardens. Miraculously, the only casualties of the disaster were the trout. The most important difference, however, is that today, Lake Peigneur is now a saltwater lake with ocean species 10 miles away from the ocean itself, all caused by some bad numbers and a 14-inch drill bit. Leave your mark on history and subscribe to Am I the Genius and Am I the Jerk, linked in the description below. Be sure to like the video and turn on the bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching! I wish more people realized how truly post-apocalyptic life after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was. In Britain, We had large cities made of masonry, aqueducts, running water, lawyers and accountants, central heating, financial derivatives, a thriving civilization. After the collapse, we lost all of that. The plumbing and concrete broke down, nobody knew how to fix it. People built mud huts inside old stadiums and amphitheaters, using them as forts. That's some Diamond City stuff right there. It took centuries for the economy to recover to the point that currency was needed again, rather than bartering. A side point, back in the day, York and Thebes were in the same country. That still blows my mind. Starfish Prime. That time when a space nuke could be seen from Hawaii and the resulting EMP knocked out streetlights in Waikiki. Almost no one I know knows about this, and it wasn't in any school books we read. You'd think a space nuke to see if we could blow up an asteroid belt would make it into textbooks, especially when tens of thousands of people witnessed a sun in the sky at nighttime. The quote, May incident in World War II. American submarines were very good at getting away from Japanese surface ships. This was because the Japanese thought American submarines could only reach a much shallower depth than they actually could, and they could never set their depth charges to these deeper depths. Congressman Andrew May decided it would be a good idea to hold a press conference announcing this fact. From then on, the Japanese set their depth charges to these deeper depths. Quote, Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the U.S. submarine fleet in the Pacific, estimated that May's security breach cost the United States Navy as many as 10 submarines and 800 crewmen killed in action. He said, I hear Congressman May said the Jap depth charges are not set up deep enough. He will be pleased to know that the Japs set them deeper now. Loose lips sink ships. Voyagers who worked for fur trade companies lived gross lives. Since they spent most of their time in a canoe with limited supplies, they made do with what they had. Gross stuff below. They were often missing teeth, so when they drank tea, they would shove a chunk of maple sugar in their teeth gaps and drink tea through it. When the tea was done, they would remove the sugar chunk, wrap it up, and save it for later. The number one cause of death for a voyager was complications of hernia because they carried heavy cargo on their backs. The average sack was 90 pounds, and they would make a contest out of who could carry the most. Often 3, and for the show-offs, 4 packs. That's 360 pounds of cargo, so of course, guts would herniate. They would tie their sashes as tight as possible around their stomach to keep all their internal organs in place. Since they try to keep limited supplies so they could carry the most cargo, they would often use their toques as bowls. They would wax the yarn to waterproof the hats, so they would eat out of their hat that had hair, sweat, skin, and probably bugs in it. They didn't pull over to the shore to go to the bathroom. When you had to go, you would go over the side of the canoe. This applies for both number 1s and number 2s. So if you had to poop, you were pooping in front of the rest of your crew. Their hygiene was awful. They often would not bathe or clean themselves up, as it protected their skin from bugs and the sun. When they got close to a rendezvous point, they would somewhat attempt to shave and clean themselves up. They made do with what they had, but learning about them has made me appreciate modern amenities like showers, toilets, and access to health and dental care. Edit. Holy crap, I got gold! I know this is cliche, but thank you. Here's some quick fun Voyager facts as a thank you. They paddled about 50 strokes per minute, and the person who could carry a tune and played the fiddle were paid the best. They used music to keep pace and move faster. In Canada, there were 2 main fur trade companies, Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Company. Those 2 companies hated each other and would get in fights all the time. Turf wars were a real thing. They were often under 5'7" because having tall people in the canoe made it difficult, and it was harder work for tall people because it took more effort to swing the paddle down. And lastly, this song, Chevalier de la Table Ronde, translated to Knights of the Round Table, was their jam. It's about when they die, they want to be buried with all the wine and their head under a tap. Gross party animals to the end. It's a bit more recent, but I love the story of Gander. After 9/11, all the planes were grounded. Almost 7,000 people, which was about 66% of the local population, were forced to land in this tiny town of Gander, Newfoundland. The whole town worked together to make sure all the passengers would have everything they needed. The local ice rink was filled with frozen food that people donated. You couldn't find a closed door in town for stranded people to take a shower or just talk. Once the grounding of planes was lifted, those passengers pooled their money together and created a scholarship for the people of Gander to use. This is one of the greatest acts of kindness that I can view in history. To this day, Gander is the only place outside the United States where they have a piece of the World Trade Center. This is the story of the biggest troll who ever lived. In World War II, there was a Spanish spy named Juan Pujol Garcia who approached the Allies to work for them. When they refused, he approached the Nazis, and they accepted him, giving him the code name Arabelle. Once he earned credentials working as a Nazi spy, he approached the Allies again, this time getting a job as a double agent, codenamed Garbo. This is where it gets unbelievable. He fed the Germans a combination of misinformation, true but useless information, and high-value information that always got to the Germans just a little too late. He even started a spy network consisting of 27 sub-agents of his own. Keep in mind that not a single one of these sub-agents existed. They were completely imaginary. But regardless, he submitted expense reports for them and had the Nazis giving him money to pay their salaries. At one point, when he had to explain why some high-value information got to the Germans late, he told them that one of his spies had died. He actually got the Germans to pay the imaginary spy's imaginary wife a very real pension for her loss. Not only did his false information get the Nazis to waste millions of dollars, but he was also instrumental in convincing the Nazis that the attacks on D-Day were just a diversion, and the real attack was yet to come, keeping vital German resources away from the front lines. He is one of the only people to ever get an Iron Cross from the Germans, which required Hitler's personal authorization since he wasn't a soldier, and an MBE from King George VI. The Battle of Attu. It was the only battle of World War II fought on US soil. Attu is an island in the Aleutians. The Japanese invaded it intending to… who the heck knows, it was far too remote to serve as a staging for an invasion of the mainland. The American soldiers who were sent there had originally been slated to go to North Africa. They were sent to the Arctic, in the spring, with gear meant for fighting in the desert. They lost more men to the elements than to the Japanese. I'm a nurse, and a few years ago I had a resident who was in this battle. To his dying day, he was reluctant to talk about it, even 70 years later. What I shared here is all he would tell me. Peter the Great often forced dwarves to get married, and him and his friends would get drunk and attend the wedding. He had a fascination with dwarves, and he once forced someone who had made him angry to marry a dwarf. Edit: since this post is getting a lot of attention, I thought I'd share that Peter basically had a fraternity, and it was called the all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters. They would drink and party basically all the time. You can find more about it on Wikipedia. During World War II, the Japanese outfitted special planes. Some were designed to be launched from submarines, with enough range to reach the west coast of the United States. The goal was to use incendiary bombs to start wildfires in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. One pilot, Nobuo Fujita, successfully dropped his bombs over the forest near Brookings, Oregon. Fortunately, a storm the night before had dampened the forest, and the fire started by Fujita's bomb was quickly controlled by the Forest Service. 18 years later, in 1962, Fujita returned to Brookings. He brought with him his family's heirloom, a katana that was over 400 years old. Fujita apologized to the townspeople for his actions during the war and revealed that if the townspeople demanded it, he would ceremoniously kill himself, commit seppuku, with the sword to make reparations for his actions. The townspeople would have none of it. Fujita was made an honorary citizen of the town and returned to visit it several times during his life, including one trip to plant trees in the forest he had bombed decades before. After his death in 1997, his daughter returned to Brookings and scattered some of his ashes there. The Fujita family katana is on display in Brookings, after being given to the town by Fujita as a token of friendship. I may not be too much of a history buff, but I really like the story of Leo Major. Leo was a Canadian soldier serving in World War II. He was assigned to the division in charge of liberating the Netherlands. One day in the summer of 1944, he was alone on reconnaissance duty when he saw two German soldiers walking nearby. He killed one and captured the other, then captured their commanding officer and an entire German garrison after killing a couple more. He came under fire from other German soldiers and just kept walking. He single-handedly captured 93 German soldiers. In February of 1945, a truck Leo was in hit a landmine. He broke his back, a few ribs, and both ankles, and was told he would be discharged. Leo couldn't give enough craps, however, and a week later, he snuck out of the field hospital he was in and stayed with the Dutch family. After getting better, he made it back into his battalion and volunteered to do reconnaissance on the city of Svola. Once he departed, he decided to take the city himself. He convinced a German soldier to relay a message back to the German army, then through the night ran around the town making all the noise he could. He shot bullets, threw grenades, captured German soldiers, burned down the Gestapo, and cleaned out the SS building in Svola. His tactics were so effective, he convinced the German army that the entire Canadian army was invading the town. So by the morning, the town was free of Germans and the Canadian army just marched in. He has a street named after him in that town now. From Wikipedia, he declined the invitation to be decorated because according to him, General Montgomery, who was to give the award, was, quote, incompetent and in no position to be giving out medals. I like the cut of this guy's jib. Diarrhea was so widespread and common in the 19th century that people would develop opium habits because opium makes you constipated. Edit, well that escalated quickly, and for the exact diseases and reasons that people had diarrhea, I can only say that the 19th century was gross and nobody knew proper sanitary practices. I'm glad you guys all enjoyed debating Imodium, and today I learned Imodium is made from opiates. If you want to learn more about opium, diarrhea, or the combination of the two, then Google it because I'm busy and Google has better resources than I. I've told this story before, but it never fails to amuse me. Strap in, boys and girls. It's time to learn about that time in pre-revolutionary France where bleeding from your anus was a fashion statement. In early 1685, King Louis XIV of France developed a fistula, a small channel near his anus, resulting in great pain. Fistulas, much like the Wu-Tang Clan, ain't nothing to screw with. Eventually, the pain got so bad that he couldn't ride a horse, sit for long periods, which is kind of important when you're a king, or even make a bowel movement without regretting it immensely. The normal remedies were applied, enemas and poultices from morning until night with zero effect. Louis decided, you know what? Screw it. Let's go down the surgical route. Unfortunately for Louis, at the time, there was no surgical route. He hired a surgeon barber named Charles-François Félix and asked him to fix him. Not entirely stupid, and not willing to risk screwing up a novel surgery on the King of France, Félix requested 6 months to practice, which he did on prisoners. Live healthy prisoners. Sometimes as many as 4 a week, in an era where antiseptics and anesthetics didn't exist. The success rates were about as you'd imagine, although at least some of the prisoners survived, and eventually Félix felt confident enough to perform the surgery on the king. And it worked! Within 3 months, the king was riding his horse like nothing had happened, and Félix was the talk of the town. People were desperate to emulate the king so badly that people who were entirely healthy would pay Félix to perform the surgery on them, and those less willing to suffer, or at least less willing to pay, would fake having the surgery, wearing bandages known as Les Royales to mimic the king, and pretend that they too were cool and with it, even though with it meant suffering from a painful condition of the anus. When Philip of Macedon had ravaged many Greek city-states, things were looking bad for Greece. He then turned his attention to Sparta, sending the doomed state a letter that read, "You are advised to submit without further delay, for if I bring my army into your land, I will destroy your farms, slay your people, and raze your city." The Spartans sent back a rather to-the-point reply, "If." It's actually more cool even than that. That was the second message of that particular exchange. In the first, Philip asked the Spartans whether he should come to Sparta as a friend or as a foe. Their reply? Neither. Robert Liston, 1794 to 1847. A surgeon. In fact, he was described as, quote, the fastest knife in the West End, and could amputate a leg in 2.5 minutes. The faster the surgery, the more likely the recovery. Though during this particular amputation, he went so quickly he also removed his patient's testicles. However, he also amputated a man's leg in less than 2.5 minutes, who would later die of gangrene. In his haste, he accidentally cut off his assistant's fingers, who would later die from gangrene, and, apparently, cut through the coattails of a surgical spectator who was so scared he died of fright. This becoming the only surgery with a 300% mortality rate. Was he performing a surgery with a broadsword or something? It's time for the most ambitious crossover in the world. The Battle for Schlossiter, or Castle-iter. If anyone told you that tankers from the 12th Armored Division of the United States fought alongside German Wehrmacht soldiers led by an SS Hauptsturmführer, as well as French POWs to defend a castle with the famous tennis player of the time, 2 former prime ministers of France, and Charles de Gaulle's sister, against an attacking force of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, you'd have called BS upon BS upon BS. But that is exactly what happened. In a small castle near Idar in Austria, the high-profile prisoners were segregated in the latter part of the war. In May, a prisoner escaped with a letter to Allied forces detailing the names and location of the high-value imprisoned French citizens. The first Allied unit he encountered was unable to effect a rescue, but started toward the prison before retreating back behind Allied lines. During this time, the head of the prison died under, quote, mysterious circumstances, and the second-in-command deserted, along with the host of SS guards. The prisoners, meanwhile, had taken over the prison and commandeered the arms left behind. In the nearby town, Wehrmacht troops, sick of the war and the Nazis, had deserted and formed a resistance unit that protected the citizens from Nazi hardline loyalists and SS retaliation. Major Joseph Sepp Gangl approached a unit of the 12th Armored under a flag of truce and requested aid. Captain John Lee agreed immediately, positioning his tanks at the city square as a show of force. Advised of the tenuous situation in the former prison, Lee set off with a number of tanks, but was unable to cross a small rickety bridge leading to Castle Idar with all his forces. He proceeded with this tank, the Besseton Jenny, 2 squads of riflemen, Major Gangl, and a truck with a 10-man Wehrmacht cannoncocker crew. On the way, they encountered a group of SS troops attempting to blockade the road, who they promptly ventilated. Arriving at the castle, the captain and the major were greeted by the unlikely sight of French prisoners working side by side with Hauptsturmführer Kurt Siegfried Schrader to shore up the castle defenses. The motley crew was not best pleased with the, quote, rescue force that didn't even quite make up a full platoon, but were happy to see any reinforcement. Lee staged his tank at the castle entrance, and the POWs, the Wehrmacht, and the 12th Armored Crew deployed around the castle into defensive perimeter. The crap was on. The next morning, a Waffen-SS group numbering over 100 launched their assault, one of the opening salvos destroying the tank that had been the heavy weapon support for the Castle Idar defenders. The attack continued in waves, with probing during the night to find weakness in the defenders' lines. Even after being ordered by Captain Lee to seek shelter in the castle, the French POWs stayed on the front, pouring a heavy volume of fire at the attacking SS troops. Morning after pillbox, the following day opened bleakly, with sporadic gunfire continuing throughout the night, as well as repeated grenade blasts and 88mm cannon fire. The defenders were running low on ammo. Somehow, the telephone lines back to the nearby town had not been destroyed, and comms remained intact for the duration of the battle. Lee and Gangl called back for the reinforcements, and they arrived in the afternoon to stomp a mud hole in SS butt. The strangest battle of an insane war came to a close. It was 5 days after the Führer died from self-inflicted high-velocity lead poisoning, and 2 days before the official surrender of Germany. Reddit, what's the craziest freaking thing you have ever witnessed in real life with your own 2 eyes? When I was a teenager, I remember being in Indianapolis waiting on a stoplight to turn green when multiple police cars went flying by with their lights on and sirens screaming. They blocked the road off right in front of me with their cruisers, and a few officers jumped out. One officer ran behind a car that was stopped in the mall entrance drive, and once he was behind the vehicle, it immediately reversed and tried to run over the cop. The driver bailed and started to run before turning around and whipping out a gun, at which point the police shot him multiple times right then and there, and he dropped to the ground like a sack of potatoes. Most incredible thing I have ever witnessed in my life, even to this day. What's your story? At a clothing option beach a few years ago, I saw a woman roll onto the beach in a human-sized hamster ball. She took off her shirt and I thought, that woman has remarkably large breast implants. She then took off her pants and I thought, that woman has a remarkably large woohoo! She continued to roll the ball around the beach for about 20 minutes while another woman filmed her before rolling back off the beach. I knew, at that moment, that I would never see anything stranger in my entire life. I still feared that I am in the background of some sort of trans hamster ball fetish adult film. Diving at about 80 feet in Molokini Crater off Maui, I was looking at a reef when felt something smack my tank from behind. I looked up and my dive buddy's eyes were like saucers. The bump was from one of 3 bottlenose dolphins. They circled around us for a few minutes, then darted away. We were just awestruck in 80 feet of water with 30 pounds of gear while these amazing animals had a good time around us. Humbling. Just be glad they had a good time by themselves and not with you because, dolphins are scary. Like, worse than sharks scary. Trust me. One of my friends pulled himself up on top of what looked like a raised concrete platform. Turned out to be a vat of cow poop with a crusted layer on top. He got on top of the outside wall, took one step, and fell through and nearly drowned in liquid cow poop. Vomited everywhere, jumped into a nearby river fully clothed to get it off. I have a couple. One, downtown Vancouver. In line for a bar at about 11:30 p.m. Homeless guy walks by me, about 20 feet, drops his pants, and takes the wettest poop I've ever seen right on the sidewalk. 2, high school. Hanging out with a friend in his bedroom. He gets into a fight with his dad. Dad barges into room, and my friend simultaneously shuts the door. On his finger. Finger came off. Now that I think about it, I live a pretty sheltered life. Thanks, Western civilization! My weirdest experience was also in Indianapolis. I was sitting at a light in a convertible, and a truck driver pulls up and shouts, "Hey, y'all want some mayonnaise?" And then picks up a huge 64-ounce plus container of mayo and throws it at me. Thankfully, I caught it. Could have gone horribly awry, though. Still to this day, I don't know why this happened. Edit, reoccurring question, not only did I eat the mayo, I was on my way to a cookout, so a lot of people ate it. I saw the 2008 Toronto propane explosion happen from my 19th floor apartment balcony about 5 kilometers away. Seeing the sky go orange and feeling heat hit you like a truck from several kilometers away freaked me out. I wondered if it was a terrorist attack and who Canada could have ticked off. I was on vacation with my family in San Francisco. 2 homeless men got into a shouting match. One yelled, "Chew on this!" Rushed a flock of pigeons, grabbed one in his hands, and hurled it at the other homeless man. The other man caught the pigeon in one hand, he had a trumpet in the other, and yelled back, "Respect all God's creatures!" and tossed it into the air. The pigeon flew away, and the man resumed playing his trumpet. Time for a gross medical story. I worked in the ER for almost 2 years. I was a scribe. This meant I followed around the doctors and took notes for them. Before seeing a patient, we would get a vague idea of why the person was in the ER by reading their chief complaint. We'd also either read the nurse's note or talk with the nurse who checked them in. We were going to see a patient with the chief complaint of, quote, skin rash, generally a pretty benign complaint. As we headed over to the room, we were stopped by the nurse who checked them in. "You're going to need a mask," she said. "What's going on?" the doctor asked. It's difficult to describe. You'll see it when you get in there. But the smell is pretty bad. You should wear a mask." She was silent for a moment. I worked in the ER for 30 years. I've never seen anything like that. We put on some masks and entered the patient's room. The stench was pretty bad, even with the masks on. The patient was an older woman. "What brings you in today?" the physician asked. "Well, I've got something going on under my left breast," the woman stated. "Okay, why don't we take a look at it?" The doctor moved the woman's gown aside to look at her breast. The woman pointed to under the breast. The doctor asked her to lift her breast. This is where the craziest thing I've ever seen comes in. As she lifted the breast, I realized something was not right. She kept lifting it, further than you really should be able to. Instead of normal pink flesh under the breast, I saw a decaying gray mess with a tinge of green, and then a rib. And then I realized I was essentially looking into this woman's chest. As she lifted the breast, it was like the hinge opening a door into her insides. Not much was identifiable, but the doctor did point out a huge mass that was essentially coming out from the breast. The doctor explained to me after we left the room that this woman had extremely late-stage breast cancer. The cancer had become so large it had started invading the chest wall, breaking down skin, muscle, anything that came in the way. That was why her skin had broken down under the breast. She also most likely had local fungal and bacterial infections in the decaying tissue, which was where most of the smell came from. Ugh, it was the craziest thing I've ever seen. Apparently, the woman was not a huge fan of doctors and just avoided coming in for about a year. She hid it from her family. I just cannot imagine living with that. And that's my story. Driving through Cleveland, I saw a naked, fat, homeless man rolling around on the sidewalk as some super skinny woman with just pants and a do-rag, no shirt or bra, was screaming at him and kicking him as he rolled down the street. Na 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 katamari damashi. I was in New York City for a meeting with a coworker in June of this past year. Since it was an amazing day out, we decided to have our meeting out in one of the local parks since it was an informal meeting and both of us wanted to enjoy the weather. After spending the morning going through our business, we both decided on lunch. Before we left, I needed to find a restroom. There was a public restroom in this park. It was well maintained and clean, but really busy. Since all the urinals were taken up, I stepped into a stall and did my business. As I am leaving the stall, I am careful to not swing the door open quickly since there were quite a few people in the restroom. Since I am stepping out slowly, I happened to notice a guy walk in wearing an apron for one of the local coffee places nearby. He walks up to a single urinal, not a trough, a single urinal that is already occupied by someone, squeezes in next to the guy, and ends up peeing on the other guy's hands. It happened so quickly that the original urinator had no idea what was happening. He backed away from the urinal, staring at his hands, screaming, "What the frick? What the frick?" The guy with the coffee apron never stopped peeing, and just said over and over, "Sorry, man." The guy who got peed on threw a punch in the crowded bathroom, and the coffee apron guy still never stopped peeing. I decided I did not want to be in that bathroom any longer and quickly snuck out. TLDR, you are never supposed to share a single urinal with another dude. Legend says that he's still peeing to this day. Man, I gotta say that the weirdest thing that I've ever seen in my life has to be somebody who isn't subscribed to Am I the Genius and Am I the Jerk, linked in the description below. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching. I've seen a lot of weird things in my current job. This morning, a guy walked in with a snake around his neck explaining that people called him, quote, Rhinestone Terry because his woohoo had bumps on it when he got erect. There was an Asian guy that fixed cars behind our shop. He only worked on other Asians' cars in our area. On our DVR, we had tons of videos of his customers peeing or taking a dump in the parking lot. Also had video of his wife scooping dog poop on our back door. I genuinely don't know what it is with all the poop in this episode, I'm sorry. One time there was a transvestite that came in here and walked straight to the front corner of our store. He dropped his pants and started jerking off while looking at us. My boss got a piece of conduit and poked him until he left. We used to fly a big balloon, kind of like what you see at car dealerships. It was an attempt to get attention and increase business. One day I was outside and had just finished filling up the balloon. I tied it off and was starting to walk back inside when a woman asked me, "How did you get that balloon up there? Helicopter?" There used to be an emergency vet next door. They were only open at night when the other vets were closed. A woman showed up in the middle of the day and shoved a truck bed full of animal organs out on their front door. Her reason was that they might need the, quote, parts. I saw two homeless guys get into a fight about 8 years ago when I first started this job. One of them pushed the other one out in front of a car passing by and killed him. He threw up his arms and screamed, "There can only be one!" My friend told me it wasn't a Highlander fight because it wasn't in a warehouse. Over the years, I've seen a lot of people crap themselves in my store. Just last week, an old man needed to use the bathroom. Before he got to the bathroom, he pulled his pants off in the store in front of people. I had to carry a computer out to this fat woman's car. When we got to the car, I put the machine in the back seat next to a kid that was eating Wendy's chili. She started crying and said that she had crapped herself. She then looked at her child and said, "It's in my coochie." He then threw up all over the back seat. I watched a guy stand about 200 feet away from our front door on the sidewalk and talk to no one. He then came in with a gun and wanted to know why we wouldn't show him any respect by talking back to him. I had a customer off themselves in a parking lot because he couldn't play World of Warcraft on a 15-year-old laptop. This was after he threw the laptop at me and I chased him out with a hammer. I saw a guy lay on his back and pee into the air while waiting for his ride across the street in a parking lot. I could go on forever with these. Take a hike to Big Bill Hells, home of challenge peeing. My mom took me to get my hair cut at a salon when I was a 13-year-old boy. I usually get my hair cut at the barber, but we didn't have the time. So, this petite gay guy is talking nice and cutting my hair. Next to me is this 14-year-old chick looking kinda cute. She has two huge gay guys cutting her hair. I'm 6'2" and 240 pounds, and I was about that size when I was 13. These two guys were lisping and snipping at her long blonde hair with their tight black shirts and huge arms. 10 minutes into her haircut, the guys cutting her hair start barking at each other that the other was cutting her hair wrong. These two huge gay guys start throwing fists and connecting with on each other's face. One stabs the other with a scissor in the arm. Blood is everywhere. The petite gay guy cutting my hair gets between me and the brawl, gets some blood on him, and gets hit in the face. The fight gets broken up, the one guy goes to the hospital, and my haircut was free of charge. That was way more exciting than the barber. I used to do security and landed a gig at the Teen Choice Awards. I landed the very best position that night, guarding some high-powered confetti blowers right next to the stage. I was underneath the section of the stage that rose up and the announcer stood. I saw every star from just a few feet away from them. Some older dude sitting near me kept turning around and later told me most of the girls here aren't wearing panties. I wasn't wearing my glasses, so it was pointless for me to stare out into the crowd. I hear them announce Megan Fox coming up to present the next award and look upwards as she walks into position. She wasn't wearing panties. I've seen numerous accidents, knife fights, you name it, but Mother Nature kicked all their butts this year. We were down in Baja at a beach called Los Cerritos. I was in knee-deep water with my daughter when someone yelled, "Whale!" Usually this means someone spotted a spout or something, so I'm thinking, no big deal. Well, a second or two, someone else yelled, so I looked up and there they were. A huge gathering of humpback whales, breaching, dancing, tail wagging. I've seen this before, but never in these numbers. Then, instead of watching the show slowly swim away, they stayed. Those whales stayed in that same spot playing for well over 20 minutes. It was the most incredible thing I've ever witnessed, and I've been around. A few years ago, I was in Boston visiting some friends and went outside to smoke a cigarette. I'm standing on the sidewalk enjoying the autumn chill, and two cars screeched to a halt in front of me. Neither moved for a minute, and so I didn't think anything of it. Just odd. Then, from seemingly out of nowhere, two cops come running at the cars with their guns drawn. The cops were screaming, "Mother effer, let me see your hands, don't move!" All kinds of deliciously profane things to shout in the middle of the day in the middle of a city. They slapped the hood of the first car and yelled at the driver to take off and then stood on opposite sides of the rear car, their guns aimed through the windows and still screaming. A few moments later, about 10 cop cars pull up, lights and sirens, and cops start piling out with their guns drawn. A couple with shotguns that they racked and then leveled at the car. I was about 20 feet away, but none of them even seemed to notice. I wasn't told to back away or anything. As this is happening, a small crowd began to gather. So, since I'm on the passenger side, I couldn't see the driver. The cops open the door on my side and pull out the passenger. He was a normal-looking guy, white guy in t-shirt and jeans, and they lay him down on the road, cuff him, and take him off to the squad car. So far, pretty interesting. Then they take the driver out and lay him on the ground, but since he's on the other side of the car, I still can't see him. Cops then start pulling things out of the car and putting them on the hood. Bottles of pills, a backpack, and then a gun. This is getting more interesting. Then, as we are all standing in rapt attention, this huge cop, black, probably 6'5" and about 300 pounds, reaches down to pick up the driver. He does so with one hand, and we all stand in amazement as we realize the driver is a midget and is dangling from the hands of this gigantic cop. The midget is screaming at the top of his lungs, "Screw you, cops, blah, blah, blah." And the cop pretty much carries him one-handed to his squad car and throws him in the back. When the cruiser takes off, there was a moment of silence, and then everyone, probably 30 bystanders, a dozen cops, everyone, starts laughing hysterically at the same time. I called every single person I knew, just so that I would not be accused of making it up. It was hands down the funniest thing I have seen. TLDR, I saw a midget get arrested at gunpoint. There was much communal laughter. I live in Philadelphia, and I was walking up Broad Street, one of the main thoroughfares in the city. All of a sudden, I hear sirens, which isn't that unusual, and I see a cop racing down the street, which also isn't that unusual. But then I see a Jeep, oblivious to this cop, start to cross Broad. At about this time, I got the, "oh crap, this is going to end horrendously" face and stopped to watch. Well, the Jeep gets about halfway across the street when the cop, who was doing at least 65 to 70, broadsides the Jeep, goes airborne, and flips end over end twice and then lands upside down. While the cop is flipping over, the Jeep is doing a barrel roll, also airborne, but underneath the cop, and this is where it reaches the point of peak insanity. After the cop lands, the Jeep lands on top of the cop, and it's like one giant pile of twisted metal, broken glass, and shredded rubber. A few seconds later, all of the other cops, who were racing to the same crime scene as the first, come barreling down Broad. They all screech to a halt, jump out of their cars with their guns drawn as if the driver of the Jeep was some mastermind terrorist bent on murdering the Philadelphia police force. OSU Michigan football game in Columbus, 2005 or 2006, I forget. After the Bucks won, I stepped onto the porch with a few friends to have a smoke. As soon as I get outside, it smells like smoke. Sure enough, there was a 7-foot-high stack of porch furniture on fire right in front of the house I was at in the middle of the road. The fire really begins to grow as dozens of people are continuing to toss more and more couches and chairs onto this inferno. Now, keep in mind, all of this takes place in a little under 1 minute. Out of nowhere, a city snowplow comes flying out of the alleyway and crushes the whole pile down to nothing and scatters it all over the road and alley. Cheers erupt from all the neighboring houses at the scene, loving the hysteria that is going on around them. All of a sudden, a huge beam of light shines down right under the street, followed by another as 2 police helicopters swoop across the area. Then, almost immediately after all of this crap is going down, a wall of police on horseback arrive. I mean, these guys own the street sidewalk to sidewalk, batons in hand, just swatting at anyone stupid enough to get in their way. They marched right down the street and dispersed the area in less than 1 minute. No one was injured. Best thing I've ever seen. One time, I was in this pretty important business meeting. There was a town involved, regarding company acquisitions for an organization which I was led to believe I had no ownership in. After investigating some fraudulence on the part of my, quote, business partners, I determined I had actually still owned 50% of the company. Having known this, as the purchasing entity had no knowledge, I sold him 500,000 units of my product before the deal went through and then refused to sell him the company, saving my town and my dad's company. That's not even the crazy part. After I revealed that a married couple in the meeting had committed fraud, the husband ran out into the testing floor, it was an auto brakes factory, and tried to escape. But while telling us to screw ourselves, he tripped and fell onto an active brake test car and accidentally flipped the switch to activate it. Needless to say, we were all pretty worried about the poor guy, but fortunately, the brakes actually worked. But the guy went flying into a chair which was being tested for durability impact. One of these giant punching bag-like weights landed directly on his balls, ensuring he would never be able to reproduce again. That's still not even the crazy part. The craziest part is that the wife of the guy who committed fraud decided to shack up with the owner of the original purchasing company immediately as they left the meeting room, and no one even thought to arrest her or anything. This is after she committed multiple accounts of fraud, maybe even attempted murder and polygamy. All of this happened right in front of news cameras and police officers, but she was, quote, like a 10, so I guess it was okay. For those not getting it, IMDb Tommy Boy. And I've been reading a movie reference this whole time. Okay, never mind then. You know how sometimes when you can see/hear someone committing an act of douchebaggery, your immediate reaction is wishing they get exactly what's coming to them? Well, one night I was sitting on a bench outside a train station, and I can hear this guy driving like a real jerkwad. I can't see him yet, but I can tell from the sounds that he's doing burnouts and donuts and the like on the public street next to the building. I say to myself, I hope that jerkwad wrecks his car. And as soon as I get out the word car, I look up and see him come screaming around the side of the building and slam his car head-on into a telephone pole. It wasn't particularly crazy by conventional standards, but the timing of it was just insane. Art teachers of Reddit, what's your draw anything you want story? Not my story, but seems to fit here. When I was in school to certify to become a teacher, we had a former principal as a professor for one of our courses who was trying to illustrate how difficult it could be to manage parent complaints and how to approach those situations with administration. His example was how he had been called into a conference once with an angry mom and the elementary school art teacher. The mom was furious because the teacher had asked the children to close their eyes and draw whatever came into their imagination. His assumption was that a student had drawn something inappropriate. Nope, the mom was mad because summoning an image in one's mind was, quote, witchcraft. So, little Timmy, what did you draw in class today?
I drew a rainbow.
It's not drawing, but I gave my high school kids a poetry assignment. They could write about anything that was school appropriate and have one curse word that wasn't a slur or the F-bomb. It had to include so much figurative language and whatnot. Girl turns in, quote, Mrs. My name is a bee. A poem about how she's tired of writing poems and that she's annoyed with me for assigning so many. Includes our requirements. I gave her a 96, a few errors, and the next poem she writes is, quote, Mrs. My name is a cool bee, about how she was sorry she was mean. I just remembered a poor little guy who drew a self-portrait. He drew with meticulous detail, and when it came down to drawing his pants, he drew the zipper so carefully, but it looked like a member. I was flummoxed about how to tell him that people might see something there that he didn't intend. My brother was told to draw an animal from any angle he wanted, so he drew a dot and said it was a very far away lion. I was substitute teaching an art class. An 8th grader drew a picture of an adult woman touching a child. I pulled the student aside after class and found out her aunt had been touching her for years when she was babysat or came to visit. I reported it, and her aunt ended up going to prison. Kids will sometimes draw things they normally wouldn't say out loud. In early middle school, we did a project where we used cardboard draped in colorful paper mache to make a sound word, like wham or crinkle. I was really into knights at the time, so I made the word that was the sound of someone unsheathing a sword. That word was schlong. I got in trouble once for drawing a pooping butt. Little did my teacher know, but the drawing was actually a poorly drawn butterfly that ended up looking like a hairy pooping butt. And when asked why I put the details I did, like the legs, an antenna, and proboscidea coming off the segmented body, I said, I don't know, don't they all look like that? I saw one at recess and thought it was pretty and wanted to draw it. Thinking of the butterfly, of course. Nope, I ended up having to go see the school counselor. High school 1977. Not a teacher. While everyone else was drawing Pink Floyd rainbows and peace signs all over everything, the biggest burnout in the class made a wide metal bracelet with intricate triangular designs cut out of it. He turned it in and got a great grade for the first project he ever bothered finishing and some well-deserved praise for his effort. Teacher handed our work back, and first thing he did was grab a pair of pliers and bent all the triangles outward, making it a thick metal spiked bracelet. I found that devilishly, disturbingly clever. As a kid who was told to do a drawing that was going to be put on a plate, drew my cat doing a poo. I was asked multiple times if I wanted to redo it. I declined the offer. So, most of my life, I ate off a plate with my cat on it doing a poo as it was my plate, and still do. My siblings had similar plates with a car and a rocket ship. Mine is clearly much better. Was around 5 or 6 at the time, and totally worth it. Still had the plate. I have a quote, design your own monster Halloween lesson. Most kids draw cute ghosts or cool vampires. One 7th grader drew a sad clown hanging by a belt from a ceiling fan. He had issues. I ran arts and crafts classes at a youth group for disadvantaged kids. Decided one day to give them total freedom. I just put out all the supplies we had and let them go crazy. Kids made some really cool works of art, all very colorful and creative. I was talking to one kid when another asked me to help him spell things for his artwork. I go over to his table with him, and he's been making a card for a boy in his class at school. He tells me his friend's mom had just died from cancer, and he wanted to make a card for him to cheer him up, but he couldn't spell anything he wanted to write. He was 13 years old, and I had to help him spell out something like, Dear blank, I am so sorry about your mom, but I will always be your friend and here for you. Love, blank. I had to help him spell his own name. He made the card totally unprompted. I feel for the guy. He was totally sweet and caring for his friend and really smart. He just not got the help he needed. Went home after and had a little sob. Edit. Hey guys, thanks for the rewards. I really appreciate all the lovely things you've been saying. I'd just like to say that I really didn't do anything special here. I only helped him spell out a card. I wish I could have done more, but I was fresh out of high school and was only volunteering. I actually had been in one of the other youth groups they ran and been asked to volunteer in this one as they needed more hands. I left shortly after this for university. I reported the incident to my supervisor, and she assured me he was getting the care and help he needed, but they could not tell me more for security reasons. He was the real hero here. I hope he and his friend are doing okay. Thanks again. One kid had to have a meeting with the principal, her parents, and the art teacher because the art teacher decided that because this 2nd grade girl only drew people without hands, the little girl felt powerless. All these adults question this child about the meaning of her drawings. She tells them, hands are too hard to draw. Sometimes, only children can understand adult problems. And this is one of them. Why do we have so many fingers? Former student here. We were supposed to do a bit of abstract artwork for a course assignment. My work was a framed square cutout from an old t-shirt I had previously used to help restain an old table. Not only did I get an A on the assignment, but I entered it into a silent auction later that semester, and someone bought it. When I was in the 7th grade, our art teacher had us do whatever we wanted to be entered in the school art fair. I was really lazy and just decided to use every color of pastel that was available to draw a rainbow of sorts on a piece of construction paper. Then, I tore it all into pieces and glued them all together again randomly. I called the piece Life, and argued that it was supposed to represent the chaos and uncertainty that is life. It ended up winning first place in my grades part of the art fair, and I ended up getting a cool art set, but really it was just me being lazy and feeding some BS about a deeper meaning. Reminder from your friendly neighborhood Reddit narrator that it's always a good idea to subscribe and like the video. Hit the bell to turn on notifications, and remember to subscribe to Am I the Jerk too, linked in the description below. As always, thanks for watching. Parent here, not an art teacher. In kindergarten, my son came home with a packet of finished assignments he got back from the teacher. One was a paper having them draw a body part with the prompt, "Here are my." Example given was feet. What did my kid draw? Butt cheeks. Drawing of the back of a person with two giant, well drawn I might add, cheeks. My husband and I laughed our own butt cheeks off when we saw it. We kept the paper, for posteriority. Student here, my art teacher was somewhat crazy. She let us draw anything we want, and to get 100%, all you had to do was tell her it, quote, had a deep connection to the earth or some other nonsense. I drew a jellyfish and told her it represented wisdom because it was immortal. When I was in second grade, our teacher told us to doodle on the back of a quiz if we finished early. I decided to draw a house high in the sky with a long staircase leading to it. To emphasize its height, I drew clouds, but it needed more. I decided to add in an airplane. Later, my teacher called me to her desk, and I got in trouble because the plane looked like it was heading towards the house, and this was right after 9/11 happened. Still have no idea what I was thinking. When I was in high school, part of the final exam/assessments in art class involved picking an object of your choice based on a written passage and painting it as best as you can. My art teacher told us about one kid who chose a book as his object. He turned up with an art book with a professional still life painting on the cover and proceeded to recreate the painting stroke by stroke. If I recall correctly, there were phone calls made to his parents and to the Board of Education over it, but the kid got away with it in the end. I assume there were some changes to the rules after that. Edit. Since this is now my top comment, here's a bonus story about the same assessment. When the time for my own assessment came around, the object I chose to paint from the written passage was a skull. The next day, the teacher made his way around the class, asking students individually about their chosen objects. The art teacher was quite elderly, and he was quite a reserved and somewhat mysterious fellow. He had also taken a shine to me as I was pretty good at art and more enthusiastic than the others. He makes his way around to me and I tell him I want to paint a skull. "And where do you plan on finding one?" he asks. I told him I had seen one of those plastic replica skeletons in the biology lab, and I was going to ask about borrowing the skull. He blew off that idea as if it were complete nonsense. He paused for a moment and then said a little more quietly, "I can get you a skull." Okay, I replied, not knowing what he was getting at really. The guy goes off into his little storeroom, rummages for a couple minutes, and comes back with a real human skull in his hand. I politely asked him how he came by a real human skull. He turned his gaze away pensively and said, "An old friend gave it to me," and left it at that. Not a teacher, but when I was in 7th grade, I drew a picture in my art class sketchbook of Barney and Elmo smoking pot and drinking booze, drawn with colored pencils and all. I showed it to my friends, and they thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. The art teacher, however, was not pleased and sent me to the principal's office. The principal then looked through my sketchbook and ripped out all the drawings she deemed as inappropriate. It shattered my soul that day, and I cried for some time afterwards. In fact, I think that's what ended my dream of becoming an artist. Screw you, Mrs. Moreno and Mrs. McKeon, for robbing me of a better future. When I was around 8 or 9, I got into drawing cars, and simultaneously into drawing tribal decorations. Probably not PC, but, you know, the type a lot of people get as a tattoo. So, I drew a car with a tribal decal, and because of the hook-like shapes in the tribal decal, I, inappropriately, named the car, quote, the Hooker. When she was done laughing, my mom took the time to explain the world's oldest profession. Whenever I got to draw something on my own, I just drew cake. I rarely let them draw whatever, because they inevitably would draw predictable cliches. 8th grade boys would draw knives with blood dripping, or an eye, and girls a unicorn. Trying to get them to draw from life was tough. Not an art teacher, but for 1 year I was a preschool teacher a few years back. It was like a Friday at 4 p.m. in the winter. I gave the kids some time to color or draw whatever they wanted. 10 minutes go by, and one of my students, 4 at the time, who I had a love-hate relationship with because he caused a lot of behaviors but could be a sweet kid when he wanted to, came up to me and said, "Look, Mrs. Blank, I made a drawing for you." I gave a warm smile and asked him to show it to me. It was a drawing of his parents doing the nasty. He even got the shaft part right with balls and everything. Totally shocked, but remained as neutral as possible because I knew if I reacted in a major way, he would have continued to make more drawings like this. This is something I learned about him. So I said, let's put that in your backpack and we can show mommy when she picks you up. Dad comes that day. More embarrassing for me. I told him about the drawing and he turned bright red, explaining the other night he had walked in on them screwing. We awkwardly laughed about it, and that was that. In 9th grade, as an end-of-the-year project, we could basically draw whatever we wanted, and we had a week to do it. Me, being the little car nerd I am, drew the entire drivetrain and suspension of a Chevy K5 Blazer. I'm a teacher, but I don't teach art. I was teaching a class of 7-year-olds who are usually a blessing, but there's just one kid who has some real problems. He can't speak English at all. Even after me spending a year trying to teach him and all his classmates progressing well, he just refuses to engage with any teacher and is extremely disruptive, often crying and screaming. I think he has special needs, but that's not handled well in China. Anyway, after battling with him to no avail, assigning him, quote, class police roles, everything, I just gave up this one day and gave him some paper to draw on whilst the rest of the kids learned without him distracting them. He drew a picture of me with a large pee-pee and lots of knives in me with blood and wrote my name in perfect English. It was eerie, but I just felt sad and concerned what had happened to this boy. The school gave him no support, and I only saw him for about an hour a week. I left the school shortly after, unrelated, and wonder how he is now. I'm an art teacher, but this story is about my substitute teacher. I asked my students what they had been drawing when I was gone. The class was absolutely silent, apart from some boys that were giggling. They were 13 years old. I asked what was so funny, and they said the substitute was great. At the same time, the girls seemed as they wanted to disappear from the classroom. So I asked why the teacher was great, and the boys just exploded. He told us to draw flying cock-a-doodle-doo. Well, I don't have to say more than that substitute teacher never came to our school again. In junior high, my art teacher pulled me aside to tell me that she was really impressed because I could draw better than her. After that, she pretty much let me have free reign, as long as what I was drawing worked towards the lesson goal, such as shading, perspective, etc. For the end-of-year project, I did a Robotech Veritech fighter in stipple, drawn only using dots. The next year, when I would have had her again for art, she paid out of pocket for me to take an art course at the community college across the street. She was an absolutely amazing teacher. Not a teacher, but in middle school, we got an assignment in art class to draw a still life of fruit. I thought the idea was totally boring and decided to put a creative spin on it. I drew a bunch of different fruits all sitting in the seats of a coliseum watching an apple kill an orange in the center ring. I failed the assignment, and my teacher even pulled me out into the hallway to tell me directly that she didn't like me or the work that I produced. Didn't let that crush my dream though, and I kept making my assignments weirder and weirder to tick her off. Reminds me of that time I got suspended in kindergarten for drawing a crappy stick figure gun. I tried to save myself that day by saying it was a water gun, since it was so crappy you couldn't tell the difference. But they weren't having it, and little Plava 27 went home that day. Not an art teacher, but when I was in late elementary/early junior high, my art teacher at the time gave us free reign. I had just learned what furries and pokemorphs were at the time. My art teacher, thankfully, just thought I couldn't draw werewolves for crap. When I was in high school, I was trying to learn how to draw perspective for the first time, and I was doodling a wolf howling, mostly because I enjoy wolves, and there's plenty of references online that I could check my work against. However, a seated howling wolf, when viewed from the front, doesn't show eyes or ears or most of the face, just an upturned muzzle and chin. I was actually kind of glad at this at first, because I sucked at positioning wolf eyes properly. I could draw pretty eyes, and I could draw heads a little, but put the two together, and it all looked wrong. So anyway, I'm drawing this wolf, and I think I'm doing a fine job of it, and I've got the muzzle and a bit of nose and the cheeks and the neck and the chest and all that, and everything looked fine. I was actually kind of proud of it. At least, I was until I got home several hours later and pulled it out again to work on it. You see, what confronted me at the end of the day was not my howling wolf, but what looked remarkably like a fuzzy, vaguely cone-shaped shaft with some kind of diseased black tip, all perched atop 4 paws and a tail. I've never drawn a howling wolf from that perspective again. In 7th grade, we were supposed to draw a fish made out of smaller fish. A few days earlier, I had learned that seahorses are fish, and I was obsessed with this small tidbit of knowledge and made a seahorse out of small fish. I got into a discussion with my teacher about whether I did the assignment correctly or not. 30 minutes and a Google search later, I got a C, which, fair, I wasn't the best painter. Not an art teacher, but my daughter in 1st grade was given an assignment to write a story and draw. She wrote and drew a story about Horny the Rhino. It amazes me how you can have names for animals that describe their appearances, like Fluffy the cat, Scaly the lizard, or the blue-footed booby. Shoutouts to ornithologists for giving birds the best names. But as soon as you try and name a horned animal, you gotta get a little more creative, otherwise you end up like this 1st grader. When I was in the 1st grade, they had everyone in every grade draw something. It could be anything. I drew an evil snail that had gotten snatched up by a bird, and I had a voice bubble that said, "I will be back," or something like that, coming from this evil snail. In the foreground, I drew my family. That was it. That was the whole picture. Flash forward to like 6 months, and my really bad drawing was chosen as number 1 in the 1st grade. Then, the school had an assembly where they showed the top drawings from each grade. So, I go up to the front with the other winners, and the principal goes through each one and says a little something about it. Eventually, they get to my drawing, and I quickly realized why I was chosen. They thought the bird was a plane, and the evil snail was my dad leaving to deploy. Important note is that this school was on a military base. My dad had never been deployed and was in fact depicted on the ground with the rest of my family. But I just stood there and accepted the award, and I never told another living soul because I was so embarrassed and guilty. I can honestly say I was one of the better artists at my school, asked to draw for the paper, design t-shirts, mugs, etc., and voted outstanding senior in art. I taught calligraphy, and one of my logos became the state logo for the state science division. I'm also somewhat of a jerkwad. We were assigned an exercise to draw our offhand, left if you're right-handed, right if you're left-handed. I asked the teacher, "How far would you like us to draw to?" Her response, "Well, you can draw all the way up to your elbow or cut it off at the wrist. Your choice." So, I drew it cut it off at the wrist, with exposed bone, tissue, and pooling blood. She was real careful with her instructions after that. I was an art teacher for 4 years, and I have so many stories. So many stories. One that comes to mind is a drawing this strange little child who was oddly obsessed with me made me as a gift. Now, for context, my personal aesthetic is what my friends affectionately call, quote, adult tomboy goth, which is to say I wear all black, somewhat androgynous clothing, and have a penchant for the dark and absurd. Of course, in work environments, I dress more professionally, but my kids all knew I was a dark-humored little oddball and they loved me for it. So, this girl is doing free draw, and every time I walk over, she covers up the paper with her arm and hisses at me like a cat, as she was wont to do. After about an hour, she scurries over to me with this huge grin on her face and announces, "Baba Yagatron, Baba Yagatron, I made you a thing!" And my lord, oh boy, it was the best gift I have ever received from a child. The drawing was of a skeleton beckoning a crying girl with no eyes into a pre-dug grave. The gravesite was elaborately mapped out with the whole underground portion where the coffin would be, a tombstone, and little flowers around the tombstone. I laminated it, and to this day it is still on my bedroom door, even after 3 moves around the country. I miss teaching. To the doctors of Reddit, what is it like when you have a doctor's appointment? I avoid disclosing I'm a doctor unless specifically asked what I do for work. I think I'm better taken care of when the doc/team is most comfortable and working in their routine. Difficult and demanding patients who request special treatment often have worse outcomes. I don't want to be one of them. I completely agree. I never tell them I'm a doctor. Same thing when I take my kids to a pediatrician. I just want to be treated like a regular patient. Only exception was when I broke my hand and needed it operated on ASAP, not 10 days later. Being an ER resident, I always wonder which one of my co-residents is working in the emergency department as I drive home from a shift, knowing if something were to happen, they would be checking my rectal tone in front of all my coworkers. And then I think about how big their hands are. With my mom, it was like this. "Mom, I think I have basal cell carcinoma on my back, but I can't see it quite clearly." "Derm, you do have basal cell carcinoma. Good job." Went to student health as a med student. Attending I worked with the week before does my PAP. With the resident. He asked, I said yes. Kept quizzing me. What am I looking for? What does it mean if the PAP is positive? Etc. I'm getting questions right, but he's being real weird about it. Realized in parking lot after appointment, he was asking the resident, not me. Rotate with said resident a few months later. Bad. Because I can see all the shortcuts they're taking and I'm aware of the examination they should be doing but aren't. Edit. I should clarify, because I'm afraid it might have given the wrong impression. Most physicians I've met seem to know what they're about, but it's easy to spot areas where you would have done something differently, and the negative examples always stick out more than the positive. The example I was thinking of was this. I didn't learn I had scoliosis until my first week of medical school. It's mild, as scoliosis goes, but I have back and/or neck pain every day. So, I went to a local MD to get checked out and see if I should be worried. I wait for 2 hours to get in. Said MD takes a cursory history, doesn't ask any of the right questions, family history of this condition, when did it start, has it worsened, etc., and in the physical exam, barely touches my back. I knew the tests they needed to do and the questions she should have asked because I was in medical school. I was there for her experience and advice. I got neither. A better doctor, or more realistically, one with more time to see patients, would have said, hey, I don't know anything about scoliosis. You need to see someone who does. Or hey, actually knowing how to deal with a reasonably common condition would have been nice, I suppose, but I don't know, I'm a lowly resident. Edit 2. Whoa, never had this many notifications before. To answer a few questions, number 1, this does not qualify as professional medical advice. If you have a medical problem, you should go see your doctor in the meat space. If you do have scoliosis, I would look around for a doctor who A, is an MD/DO with an orthopedics background, whether as an actual orthopod or sports med, or B, is a practicing DO, you'll have to Google it, who does OMT and is familiar with scoliosis. Just my 2 cents. Opinions on chiropractors vary wildly in the medical community, and I won't get into that here because frankly, I'm not informed enough to comment. Number 2. Several people have asked how this uppity med student knew anything in his first week of med school. Fair question. I was told I had scoliosis in the first week of med school. It was 6 months to a year before I got it checked out. Never had time to do anything those first 2 years, especially not go to the doctor. Number 3. As others have pointed out, never be afraid to seek a second opinion. Doctors are human, and even hyper-educated humans make mistakes. Not only that, but frequently, diseases don't present the same way in the same patient every day of the year. Things can be messy in the real world. Complicated diagnoses may take time and may have to work through alternative diagnoses to get to the truth. Male gynecologist here. When I have a patient come in for a PAP, it is always a bit annoying when they leave their underwear on under the gown. I have to step out of the room and wait for them to remove it. When I went in for my first physical in years, I stripped naked under the paper gown. Apparently, guys don't do this. They leave their underwear on. Who knew? My family doc, who is also my best friend, had a good laugh at my expense over this breach in etiquette. He also texted me the night before to let me know he was putting the KY in the fridge for my exam. Not a doctor, but was a medical assistant in an OBGYN practice for a while. We were near a very large medical center, so would regularly get physician patients. My favorite was this physician couple who would come in for pregnancy check-ins and refuse to let me take the woman's blood pressure. The husband would bring his own stethoscope and BP cuff, and they would sit down into this weird, intimate BP taking ritual that took forever while I just kind of stood off to the side. I told the doc I was working with about it, and she's like, "It's okay. I know them. They're like that. I'll take it again when I see her." So weird. It truly depends on the way you act. Most of the time, I won't tell the doctor that I'm also a doctor unless specifically asked about it or if there is a slip of my tongue about symptoms or any other medical words. Some doctors tend to be not too specific when they know you're a doctor because, quote, you already know what's happening. Sometimes, even my wife gets the ask your husband to clarify your questions. I try to have an open mind when I'm the patient because we are trained to think the worst, so there is a lot of cancer in my mind. Currently, I work in a palliative care unit. I have had medical patients and carers, and I would say that it is truly diverse how they react. We are also human and we are sick and vulnerable. The doctor vein can go completely off or go on overdrive. Turning it off is better and less intrusive most of the time. The test results came in. It's bad news. You're not subscribed to Am I the Genius or Am I the Jerk, linked in the description below. And you haven't liked the video either. But it's not too late to turn your life around. Please, subscribe. It's for the better. Just kidding. Thanks for watching. Not a doctor, but whenever my dad, who is a doctor, took me in for an appointment when I was a kid, it was always super awkward because if anything was done even remotely incorrectly, he'd basically do the medical equivalent of the let me speak to your manager routine. Which I kind of understand in that context, since it's your kid's health you're talking about and not a freaking expired coupon, but still, made me want to melt through the floor. In my experience, doctors tend to be pretty decent patients when admitted to the hospital. They know the routine, they get to know the nurses, they try not to hassle anyone, they can speak to their own doctors as colleagues, etc. Nurses, on the other hand, feel it is very important for you to know at all times and in every sentence that they are nurses, and they are much better at nursing than you. I will say there was this one instance of a doctor/patient and a hospitalist getting into an argument that was pretty interesting. Basically, doctor/patient disagreed with what the hospitalist was doing and asked if hospitalist had read any of the recent studies which suggested that he, instead, follow a different protocol. Hospitalist was not down with the quote, let's talk as colleagues, and decided to go full on, screw you, I'm the only one wearing pants in the room right now. There was a mild argument, but remained incredibly civil. 2 days later, the hospitalist was fired. Doctor/patient's brother, or some other close relation, was the CEO. Nurses tend to thrash. Doctors go for surgically precise cuts. One time, I got a page about a patient who was still having some pain that wasn't relieved with the Tylenol she had specifically requested earlier. So, I ordered Toradol/Ketorolac. For those unfamiliar, Toradol is an NSAID, i.e., the same drug class as Advil/ibuprofen and Aleve/naproxen. The only difference is that it is not available over the counter and it can be administered both orally and parenterally, IV/injection. I get another page like 15 minutes later from the charge nurse about how this patient refused the Toradol because she is a nurse and does not want to be given any, quote, narcotic pain medication. I explained the situation to the charge nurse over the phone and got the feeling that the patient was under the impression that she was being given tramadol, which technically is an opioid, but not one of the good ones by any stretch. A discussion ensued, and despite very clearly explaining what I just wrote about Toradol in both lay and medical language, this nurse just insisted that she was right and vaguely insinuated I was trying to turn her into an addict. Her argument basically devolved into her shouting, I've been a nurse longer than you've been a doctor, and I know what I'm talking about. I tend to give an honest effort to educate patients, but at some point, you just have to pick your battles. So, she got some naproxen, and I made it clear to the nursing staff that unless things significantly changed, either with her condition or her attitude, I did not want to get any more calls if she was still complaining of pain when the naproxen didn't work as well as she wanted it to. I'm a nurse, and I don't like announcing it when I am being treated medically. My OB knows what I do because I work with her. Sometimes they figure me out if I let some jargon slip. I don't bring it up because I'm an OB nurse, and generally, I have little knowledge about other specialties. I don't want them to leave information out because they assume I know. I also don't want them to feel like I am judging them and the care they give me, and have them act weird around me as a result. I have a doctorate. I visit the medical doctor very infrequently, but after a little initial confusion, my GP once remarked, "Oh, you're a real doctor." Med student. Had to go to the ED and then surgery for appendicitis. Got pimped by the surgeon. Felt bad, man. Edit. Getting pimped as a medical student is when you get grilled by your attending about facts about medicine that often are minutia they only know. Sometimes facts not even relevant to medicine. Even more often, the questions are, quote, read my mind type of questions. Your embarrassment and fear is what causes you to remember these facts, so they're used as a, quote, teaching tool. As a nurse, I could tell precisely which topics individual baby surgeons were traumatized by based on which BS orders and details they obsess over, and I curse whatever attending did that to them every time it becomes my problem. Speaking from both perspectives as a younger primary care physician. As a patient, my appointments are 50% what I'm there for and usually very direct, e.g., I have a sinus infection. It is now thick yellow-green discharge with fevers and present over 10 days. I think I may now need antibiotics. He will take a quick peek, then just give me a script. Then 50% non-related conversation regarding how my practice is going, learning a thing or two about a new specialist practice or tips and tricks of the trade. My doc is a very chill, well-versed, and quite an experienced physician who always teaches me a thing or two. As a physician, I also have multiple physicians as patients. My experience varies by specialty. Family physicians' patients seem more chill and relaxed, and usually drop by with a cup of coffee. Pediatricians who are patients are really fun to be around, but some of them seem to have underlying anxiety and at times fairly demanding. Internists are just so intimidating as patients, especially when older and more experienced, but always teach me a thing or two and force me to stay up to date on my guidelines. I also find specialist medical knowledge are more versed in their specialty. An ophthalmologist, as expected, won't know much about gynecology and PAPs, as their last PAP they did was in med school. Not a doctor, but as the husband of a nurse, it's horrid. My wife and the doctor/nurse practitioner will sit and bat ideas back and forth until they can get my wife to accept the diagnosis as her own idea. I'm a doctor. We make terrible patients because we tend to minimize or rationalize every warning sign. Going for a doctor's appointment basically reminds us that we can also get sick, and since we have the burden of knowledge, we're just hoping we don't find something that'll force a lifestyle change. Otherwise, most times it's been a pretty standard experience in terms of registering, waiting, and being seen for 15 minutes. If you go to someone you know personally, which I actually recommend against, you might get some preferential treatment, but it's mostly the same. Other way around, I'm a nurse and was taking care of a doctor I work with. Awkward. She asked me if she could give a urine sample, and she wasn't in for something I'd usually get one for, but then she made me nervous because she should know that. So I was like, "You're the doctor, you tell me." And she said, "Nope, you're the one calling the shots now." And I was like, "Okay, well, I think we are good with that one then." It was pretty awkward all around, but I work labor and delivery, so we deliver a lot of our own nurses and doctors, which is strange, but also nice. Today I learned that doctors go see other doctors. I thought they healed themselves naturally, like glowy mist thingies oozing out of their bodies and raising up into the air. But I have heard of barbers going to other barbers. My PCP doesn't know I'm a physician. When he asked, I lied about my profession. Not a doctor, but trained first aider for 20 plus years now. Step 1. The precursor. I'd been going blind for months. Not just a little, but my vision, which was corrected to 20/20 normally, was now utter crap even with my glasses on, to the point where I couldn't read text on a monitor. Docs can't figure out what's going on, so I worry for weeks, test after test. Step 2. The night. This was the night I figured out what was wrong with me. I was suddenly nothing but thirsty and peeing. Like, get up every hour and stagger to the back room to empty a full bladder and then chug a quart of water thirsty and peeing. And when I get up in the morning, I realize I need medical attention because I was apparently a diabetic. I then chugged a 2-liter of Dr. Pepper because hyperglycemia is a lot less lethal in the short term than hypoglycemia. Didn't know if I'd already pushed past the butt end of hyperglycemia, but my first aid training was in the right place. Step 3. The exam. Go into the triage. Nurse takes my BP and vitals. Observes that I'm obviously not 100% there mentally. Docs get an IV in me, and as it flushes, they draw blood as well. I share that I think I'm diabetic, and the AP and nurse both smile, ignore it, and spend 4 hours asking me about what drugs I'm on. Step 4. Smug face. I was diabetic. No apology from the doc, but my face was suitably smug every time he talked to me. Pretty great, really. Front of the line type stuff. Call my PCP friends or partner and say, "Hey, what are you doing for lunch? I've got a thing on me I want your opinion on. I'll buy you lunch." Or a radiologist. "Hey man, my shoulder's been killing me. I lifted too much with it and now it's borked. Mind doing an MRI? Sure. What's lunch look like for you?" Basically, I end up buying people lunches and they don't have to document anything. Win-win. I try not to flaunt my title, but it does have its advantages. Several years ago, I needed shoulder surgery. The morning of the surgery, the anesthesiologist and his nursing student came in. He asked if anyone had consented me for my nerve block. I said no, and his nurse started doing the prep work, draping my shoulder, cleaning, etc. The anesthesiologist starts to explain to me. What we are doing is called a stellate nerve block. Saying it very slowly, it's where we take a probe and we try to find the nerve that goes down your shoulder. Again, all being said very slowly so I can understand. And then we do, I'm sorry, I'm one of the radiology fellows here in the hospital. His whole demeanor relaxed, and he said at a normal pace, "We're doing a stellate nerve block." He gently pulled the nursing student out of the way and finished the rest of the procedure himself. When I go to see a doctor, which is not often enough since I don't need no stinking doctor, it's nice to be able to cut to the chase and not have the minutia explained. However, I make it clear that I'm no longer on my playground, and it's their expertise that I'm paying for. I mostly sit there and try and convey what is wrong/what I need without telling the doctor. It's also hard not to just give them your history like you'd take a history and preempt their questions. Lay people don't announce, "Nothing runs in my family," without being asked. I always feel it's a bit twatty to say, "I'm a medical student/doctor" at the start, but then it's awkward when they work it out and you haven't told them before. I also feel under pressure to understand or remember exactly what they're talking about and prove my knowledge too. My dad is a pharmacist, and the number of times I'd come out of an appointment with a certain prescription and he would call the doctor to tell them to change it is countless. Most of the time he was colleagues or had a 1 degree of separation kind of relationship with these doctors, so they didn't seem to mind, even though it was awkward for me personally. Typically, he knew of a better option or just one of the generic, which would save him a bunch of money. I had one eye doctor who was mad though, so that was not fun. I am super polite, show up early, and yield to expertise that isn't specific to my specialty, radiology. I imagine that in some ways it's easier for my docs because they don't have to dumb anything down for me. I'm a nurse, and the worst thing for me is blood draws and IVs. At work, I'm the one they look for when there's a tough stick no one else can hit. I can tell in the first 30 seconds if the person knows what they're doing, but unless they're really hurting me, I try not to micromanage. Also, I have high blood pressure that runs 130/80 on a good day. If you let the air out of the cuff in 5 seconds and say it's 110/60, I don't trust you anymore. Not a doctor, but a medical lab scientist. My doctor knows what I do and sometimes jokes, "You could run this yourself, right?" Went to the ED and the RN asked if I was an MLS because she set the tubes she drew from my arm down without mixing them, and I immediately began to mix them. It's important to mix them because certain ones are rejected if a clot forms. She was like, "Great," without sarcasm. Another ED visit, the nurse learned what I did and insulted my career. "You just push buttons all day?" No. The instrument can't tell between a blast and a mono. I do. I go to an office outside of my job because I don't want my employer to have access to my medical record. Not that I have anything significant in my medical history to hide, and not that my employer can legally access my file without my consent, but I still like it this way. I started seeing a nurse practitioner out of necessity of getting an appointment, and now I choose to see her. She's thorough, she listens, and we get along really well. She actually gave me her personal email in case I needed to get a hold of her for any reason. That's not something you do for patients, but she knows I get it, and I would never abuse that privilege. 4th-year medical student. I tore my bicep, and before surgery, the anesthesiologist used an ultrasound to place a nerve block in my brachial plexus. This happens to be one of the biggest pain-in-the-butt bundles of nerves in the human body. It crisscrosses every which way and sends off branches which sometimes reconnect. I'm hopped up on benzos with a huge needle in my neck, and this dude is like, "What are the nerve roots of this little guy?" pointing to some blurry line on the screen. Screw that guy. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, linked at the top of the description. And if you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot, linked in the description too. Either way, thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.